Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin in 10 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and silence all cell phones. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andrew Ross Sorkin with John Meacham.
All Good morning.
They didn't clap for me yesterday, so.
That's not true. That's not true.
I do want to point out, Jamie, stand up and show everybody what you're wearing. It's Halloween in January. All right. Oh. So welcome to CNBC West. The great Andrew Ross Sorkin, that's how he signs his checks, or he makes us sign his checks that way, has written who's really the central historian of our most recent crash in Too Big to Fail, and which we hope is true of the United States, but we're waiting. Went back to 1929 and did something that a lot of the Dork Caucus, of which I am a happy member, did, which is to really go into the archives to recreate in a repertorial way the moments of the seminal economic event, really, I would argue, of the 20th century, given its political implications and its cultural implications. So why did you do it?
Well, first of all, thank you guys for having me. This is spectacular. I've never been to this event. And let me just say, I'm kind of in a pinch me moment to be sitting next to this gentleman who's a hero of mine. And no. And I just want to say this about you, if I could, and this is not a pandering thing. I spent 8 years on this book, and I'd never really written about history like this, and I had no idea whether the book would work or not or anything like that. And I sent it to this gentleman who I admire so much, and you wrote back the nicest note in the whole world, and it changed my whole, really, I want to thank you, because he also wrote a little nice note on the back of the book too, but it really, for somebody like me who is trying to,
I did, didn't I?
You did. It really was something.
Did you do AI Walter Isaacson?
No, that's.
Doris is here too.
That's the real guy.
Do you know my favorite Doris story is someone tweeted out about 9 months ago that if Doris Kerns Goodwin and Mr. Rogers had a one-night stand, I would have resulted. And I thought it was great. Doris was kind of pissed off. And so she learned how to use her cell phone, and she called me. And I said, Mom. She said, that's not funny. And I said, why? It's not funny. She said, I'd love to have you as a son, but this makes me out to be a floozy. Couldn't Mr. Rogers and I have at least had dinner? And I said, no, he picked you up in the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival bar.
Wow.
Go ahead. Honestly, but look,
but
you
anyways, just thank you. That's all. Let me just.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's an honor.
To answer your question, I'd written this big book, Too Big to Fail, back about the financial crisis in 2008, and the truth was, people used to ask me all the time, how did 2008 compare to 1929, and I never had a great answer for them. I had read the great John Galbraith book about 1929 in college, and that was about my understanding of what had happened. And I thought, I should learn more about this. And I went on vacation. I actually bought a whole bunch of books that had been written, mostly a couple in the 30s. There was some, Galbraith's book was from the 50s. There was two really interesting authors who wrote a book about this period in the 70s. But that was about it.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, nobody had really written the book the way I wanted to read it, which was I loved those sort of, those books that put you in the room, that make you feel like you're actually there, where you actually get to see what they're saying to each other, what's incentivizing them, what's motivating them, because I'm of the view that nothing's black and white, and when you get in the room, everything's gray, and that's where it's interesting. And so I thought, maybe there's an opportunity to do something like that. And then I happened to be at Harvard University giving a lecture, and I got there early, and I walked into Baker Library, and I knew that Thomas Lamont, who turns out to be a character in this book, who was running J.P. Morgan at the time, his family had donated his papers to the library there, and I asked to see a couple of the boxes, and I just sat there, and as I'm opening the boxes, I'm seeing that his secretary is keeping transcripts of his meetings in the Oval Office with Roosevelt and his letters back and forth with Hoover. And I thought to myself, wow, maybe you actually could do this.
And don't we love her?
Yes.
Amazing.
However, the archivist said to me, Andrew, you can't do this book. I explained to the archivist what I wanted to do, and she said, there's a lot of stuff on Lamont, but there's not really a lot of material in 1 or 2 or 3 places or 4 places that I'm even aware of that you could go find. And that was like a challenge. It was like she and I thought, okay, I got to figure this out. She was right. There was not 3 or 4 or 5 or even 10 places that you could go mine.
Right.
It really turned into this sort of scavenger hunt over sort of 30, 40 different universities, and ultimately finding families who gave me documents. And ultimately, the big one was I had to convince the New York Federal Reserve to give me their board minutes. That actually became sort of a treasure map for me. 100 years later, they had never made those public. And that was a big moment.
Fantastic. So you applied your day-to-day skills to the longer-term project. You were using shoe leather.
Totally, but it wasn't even just. It was going to the libraries. It was sitting with the documents. But it was also, and I think Too Big to Fail helped inform this book. Because I was able to talk to the major actors in 2008 about what had happened and what they were thinking, and so it helped me think about, okay, if I am Charlie Mitchell, who's the main character in this book, who runs a bank called National City, he's probably the Jamie Dimon of his time back in 1929. Who would have I been talking to in this moment?
Right.
What would have I been thinking about? And so then I would then try to go do reporting and research and looking through archives to try to go find that material. Interestingly, Charlie Mitchell has virtually no archive. The main character of this book, that's one of the reasons I think no one had ever really done this before. And so it was always having to say to yourself, okay, he's at a meet. I know he's at this meeting because I have these board minutes, but who are the 5 people he likely talked to after the meeting? And then going to find their archives and praying that in their archives they wrote a letter to somebody else to say, I just spoke to Charlie and he said X. And that's how so much of the book ultimately got put together. And then I would be taking that material. I might find depositions where you see transcripts. They'd ask Charlie, what did you do in this moment? And he'd say, I told my wife, blah, 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 blah. And then they would interview the wife. And his wife would say, yeah, Charlie called me and told me this. And then I would go find a picture or the architectural diagrams of where they were in that moment so that I could put the reader there.
So,
but I had to do that over and over and over again.
Yeah, that's the damn thing about this. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah. It's like, and you're right though. You want the person who said. I mean, there's a great Plutarch insight that there are moments where a chance remark or a small gesture tells you as much as the greatest battle or the most important debate. So it's the offhand. If you can find the offhand comment.
Yes, always.
The Bible understood this too, right? It's the telling detail, the size of the rock, So tell me, this is slightly unfair, but you came out.
Here I am. Throw it as hard as you can, my friend.
All right. So we're in a moment where many of the richest people and most significant economic actors in the United States and in the world are in a, how to put it, ambivalent to subservient relationship with political power.
Yep.
Was that true in the era you wrote about? What was the relationship between the moneyed class and the political class?
So the shocking part about this, for me as a reporter or a writer in this circumstance, was it wasn't that different.
It never is.
I thought that, you'd say to yourself, oh, back in the good old days, money, didn't influence Washington in the same ways.
Oh, yeah, that was never true, yeah.
Or
Hamilton had no issues, yeah, right.
And And so, yeah, you saw so many of these CEOs, making their way to the Oval Office, sitting with both President Hoover, sitting with President Roosevelt. One of the real surprises for me actually came when I felt like some real sleuthing, if you will. I was fascinated by Carter Glass, who's also a major character in this book. You may know Carter. Carter was a senator in Virginia who created the Glass-Steagall bill, which broke up the banks from the investment banks and the commercial banks. And that was a bill, by the way, that I think after 2008 and the financial crisis, a lot of people went back to look at and said that might have prevented the crash, but even more importantly, was sort of put up on a pedestal as a great pure piece of legislation that was done for all of the right reasons. And when you get, without giving away the whole book, when you really understand how that bill was created, it shocked me. Part of the bill was physically written by a banker at the behest of Roosevelt, interestingly, to screw over, if you will, another bank. So this was effectively a family member of the Rockefeller family who was competing at Chase against J.P. Morgan and wanted some of that legislation effectively to hurt J.P. Morgan. So yes, a lot of the same kind of strange bedfellows that we see today, I think very much existed then. It was also, by the way, I think the first period of time where these CEOs and billionaires, back then multimillionaires, by the way, there were 2 billionaires in 1929. In fact, there was a famous article with the headline when it just happened. It was called Our Second Billionaire. The Rockefellers were first, Ford was second. And it was the first time that these people, through the media, really became celebrities. I mean, I think that's the other sort of unique piece of the 20s. So much of our society today, I think, actually sort of started, sort of the modern capitalism that we know started in the 20s. And by the way, Time Magazine, 1923. So many of these, Forbes started in 1917. So many of these individuals, all of a sudden are getting on the covers. It used to be, Babe Ruth and athletes and celebrities, and then the business folk, the financiers, are getting on the cover of the magazines.
The other, I think the 20s is probably the most analogous period. The other thing that I always want to point out is, if you think about it, until 1924, if you were an American householder, you totally controlled the information that came into your home. You decided what books to read, what newspapers to subscribe to, what magazines to subscribe to. And then you buy this thing, this crazy information superhighway thing called a radio.
Yes.
Which was not commercially available until 24.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly what people in Hollywood and New York think matters to you because it's in your house. And so it was the early iPhone, really.
It was the early iPhone, and in terms of the stock market, RCA, which was really the monopoly power in that space at the time, that was the NVIDIA of its time. Yeah. It became like a meme stock for the world. By the way, they had the patent on television too. So the technology, it wasn't wrong to think that this was the future, but people got crazy about radio.
Right.
That was the ticker symbol, radio.
So I'm not exactly a numbers guy.
Okay. You don't have to be a numbers guy to read this book.
That's exactly right, which is why I liked it. Because actually, I wasn't even sure what this meant. But I was once asked to do a word problem in high school at my school, and I can't say I was doing very well. And so I just started riffing on the word problem. And my teacher said, Meacham, you're so full of shit, your eyes are turning brown, which I didn't think was supportive. But one of the powerful things you do in this is explain the psychology.
Right.
So for those of us who think that, for instance, the markets in this moment, the market is up and down a little bit, but ultimately strong, mm-hmm. right? There's all this chaos. There are people. One of the things driving our politics is that people don't believe in an economic future. And yet, things seem to kind of rock along. And is it because, and put us back here too, are there moments in 29, in 08, 09, now, and obviously different reactions in those 3 different points, where our economic fates are determined not by external factors, but by what we decide, by what we feel?
Well, sure. I think there's a huge part of our economy which is psychological. It's a business of confidence, right? As long as people are confident, things seem to continue. And then, historically, at some point, that confidence breaks. And the moment that confidence breaks is when trouble happens. Typically, by the way, trouble doesn't have to happen simply when confidence breaks. The real sort of match that lights the fire of any crisis is when confidence breaks on top of some kind of remarkable debt load. Debt is the match that lights the fire. And so, you go back to 1929, you look at 2008, we can look at a whole bunch of different financial crises. It's always when there's too much debt in the system that things become problematic. So one of the other things that surprised me about 1929 that may speak to where we are even now is the stock market. By the end, people think, oh, terrible crash in 1929. And it's true, the stock market fell between October and November in 1929 by 50%. But by the end of 1929, if you just looked at a chart and you didn't really know what was going on, it was only down by 17%. Didn't look so bad. The reason that it was a problem was because when it fell by 50%, most Americans who really experiencing the stock market for the first time, they were walking into brokerage houses on the corner streets like Starbucks. I mean, they were literally had populated everywhere, and they were getting loans. So they'd put down $1 and they'd get a loan of $10. So it was 10 to 1. And so when the stock market dropped by 50%, it wasn't just the stock itself fell, it was that then the individual owed 10 times that amount of money, and therefore we're getting calls called margin calls, which effectively were, you have to pay us back and pay us back now, you can't hold on, and therefore you're going to have to sell your house. And so that's a little bit of how I think when the confidence gets sucked out of the system, things get really bad. But I think it's truly the debt meets the confidence.
What percentage of Americans own stocks in 1929?
Shockingly, only a small amount.
I would think
so. It was probably under 5. There's no great calculation, but interestingly, it wasn't just that the American public was touching stocks. It was also the elite were. So you start to think about sort of the psychological impact on the confidence of the people who are running these companies and how they felt, because they had also, by the way, lost their shirts in the middle of this. And so you sort of had this confidence get sucked out of the system. By the way, it wasn't preordained that just because there was a crash in 1929 that all of a sudden we had to land in the Great Depression with 25% unemployment in 1932. There were a whole bunch of dominoes that fell. The crash was really just the first domino, but the other dominoes were a series of horrible policy choices, in part by President Hoover, in part by the Federal Reserve at the time, and a whole bunch of other things that took place, which I try to document, that I think explain how we got to this moment.
I was going to ask you, so did the crash trigger the Depression?
So there's a big debate about that. I say yes. I say it triggered the Depression, but again, it didn't have to happen that way. So when you think about, we have a crash, and then the question is, if you miss the crash on the front end, meaning if you're the Federal Reserve or the president, who, by the way, President Hoover only got the job March 4th, 1929, and the crash happens in October. So I'm somewhat actually sympathetic on trying to get ahead of it on the front end. The Federal Reserve, interestingly, when you go through the diaries of the members of the Federal Reserve, they knew there was a problem. They wanted to stamp it out. And one of the reasons I would argue that they ultimately didn't, and one of the things they were debating was sort of a lot of things we debate now. Could they raise interest rates enough to sort of try to end the speculation? Should they lower interest rates? What should they do? But one of the reasons that they didn't was they were so cognizant of the politics of the moment. This gets to sort of the independence of the Federal Reserve idea. Not that Hoover was telling them what to do, but that back then the Federal Reserve was so new. It was born in 1913. They still called it, in some cases, a, quote, experiment. And they were so cognizant that if they tipped the economy over and were held responsible for that, not only were they going to get it hauled in front of Congress, they thought the experiment unto itself could end. So I do think on the front end, there were things that they didn't do that they should have done. And then on the back end, I think one of the lessons that we've learned when you have a financial crisis, one of the ways to stop it, for better or worse, is to throw money at the problem. And what did we do in 1930 and 31 and 32? We did the opposite. We went into the austerity mode. We said, let's not do that. And then on top of that, President Hoover layers on tariffs. And those tariffs really led...
What's a tariff?
So in 1930, President Hoover layered on the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And interestingly, Hoover was so desperate to get himself elected in 1928 that when he was going around the country trying to get farmers to vote for him, he had pledged to them that he would implement tariffs. That's why this all happened. And he thought that by the time 1930 rolled around, despite every economist and Wall Street banker, going down to Washington begging on their knees, don't do this, it's going to have a real impact on the economy, he thought, well, I'd made this pledge to the farmers, I need to make good on the pledge. Well, 12 months later, you had trade fall by 60%. So you could sort of see how these things could spiral. So that would have been, for example, another domino.
So compare and contrast, particularly when we get to 31, really 31 to 33 period, Hoover and Roosevelt.
So I have a more sympathetic or empathetic, maybe not empathetic is the word I'd use, view of Hoover. And not that I have a negative view of Roosevelt, but I think there were a whole bunch of things taking place that made this very complicated. So I think Hoover knew what to do, or after he'd made a series of mistakes. So he originally thought that this was a psychological problem. That was the other big problem. And this is sort of like every president who thinks that they can jawbone their way into...
The fundamentals are strong.
And if you could just tell the American public over and over again that things were better than they really were, that people would believe you. By the way, I think we could argue on a bipartisan basis that we've had presidents, a current president, we had our previous president tell us these things and the public didn't believe it. Hoover tried that, it didn't work. But I do think he understood by the middle of 31, 32, he understood he needed to do something, but also thought, recognizing where he was politically, that there were certain things he couldn't do. So the transition of Hoover to Roosevelt's a very interesting one, because I think at that moment, even prior to that, he knew you had to probably save the banks. You needed to rescue these banks. You needed to try to put in some kind of guarantees around the banks, even though it was anathema to him politically to do it, but also thought that if he did it and did it without effectively the American public's sort of backing and therefore Roosevelt's backing, that it wouldn't actually it wouldn't actually work as a sort of confidence booster. But interestingly, because Roosevelt had now won, now there's a several month-long stretch before Roosevelt's inauguration, Roosevelt doesn't want to agree to sort of support something that Hoover wants to do because he doesn't want to be stuck with it if it doesn't work. So he says, effectively, talk to the hand, I'm not doing this, and effectively lies to him and suggests he's never going to do it.
No, not Franklin Roosevelt.
And then effectively, the second he gets in office, he does exactly what Hoover wanted him to do. Hoover won't get credit for that.
No. I'm pulling you back and forth, but I must say when you said that debt was one of the critical factors,
always.
That wasn't wildly reassuring in our own time. So put on your, you must get asked this all the time, but.
Is it going to happen now?
You don't even need me. Where's Doris?
Right. So, interestingly, there's sort of two issues that I would argue are sort of at play today. One is that most of the debt that's in our system today is more opaque than it's ever been. So after the 2008 financial crisis, we implemented Dodd-Frank and a whole number of other regulatory measures to try to prevent the next crisis. And in the process of doing that, we effectively made it less attractive for banks to lend money and made it a lot more attractive for private equity firms and what's now called private credit to emerge. A less regulated, if not unregulated, world to lend money. So a lot of the lending that goes on today is, I would say, if Jay Powell were here, or Kevin Warsh, maybe our new Fed chair, were here, he'd say, I can't see into where all the debt is. So I don't think we have a full sort of true measure of sort of how much debt is holding up our economy on the corporate side. And I think that's something I worry about in the context, there's so much euphoria around AI, there's an extraordinary amount of spending. Will this, all come due at some point? Of course it will. The question, of course, is when. It could go on literally for several years, if not more. The bigger issue around debt today, though, is the federal debt. So back in 1929, there was a federal budget surplus. Today, we have $38 trillion of debt. People always ask me, could we ever have another 1929? Or really, what I think they're asking is, could we ever have another 1932? And the only real way I think you get to that place is the following. The playbook we learned works in a financial crisis over the last several decades is, as I said, to throw money at the problem, not to pursue austerity. And so Ben Bernanke, who did his thesis at Princeton on the Great Depression, broke out that playbook in 2008. I would argue to great success, even though it was very unpopular. Bail out the banks, throw money at the problem, but it did work. We did it again, by the way, during the pandemic. And so the argument would be, well, we could have some other kind of crash or crisis. And what would the U.S. government do? It might say, oh, well, we know what to do. The playbook says, write a check. And maybe the government says, okay, we're going to write a check for $5 trillion. And that's the kind of money you'd probably end up having to write a check for the next time we actually run into something of this magnitude. Well, at $38 trillion, we would all of a sudden then have $43 trillion of debt. And the question that I have is whether there's some kind of invisible line among investors around the world that buy bonds from the United States government where the investor class says, we're not doing this anymore. We're happy to loan you money, but you're going to have to pay us an extraordinarily higher interest rate, maybe 2, 3, 4 times where we are today. And that unto itself forces you into an austerity sort of cycle. And that becomes a vicious cycle, and that leads to unemployment and the like. And then, by the way, layer on whatever you think the great benefits of AI are, but also the conundrum that may relate to employment. And that's, if you needed to see your doomsday scenario of how you get to 1932 again, I think that's how it happens. But again, I don't think it has to happen.
So
you're so glad you came here this morning.
Yeah, this is great.
For an uplifting discussion.
This is great. Once again, Jamie has a Klonopin bar outside. So I want to ask you about you in a second. But
okay.
If people, we're all sitting here thinking, things are probably in your own life probably okay. Is that how people felt in September 1929? What was the investor class feeling? Well,
it was actually it was interesting. The truth it was a very mixed situation. One of my favorite characters in this book is a woman named Evangeline Adams. Evangeline was an astrologer, and you might say to yourself, what does this have to do with anything? Every major banker, including J.P. Morgan, used to go visit with Evangeline, who had an office in Carnegie Hall, to find out what to do with their money and what was going to happen to the stock market. And she would tell you that the stock market was going to the heavens. Meanwhile, you had people like Roger Babson, who created Babson University, who was sort of the Nouriel Roubini of his time. If you remember, there was a famous NYU professor in 2008. They called him Dr. Doom. Well, Roger Babson was Dr. Doom, and he would tell you that everything was going to come crashing down. So there was a debate happening. I don't want to say there was no debate, but the hardest part about timing a market is you can see the train coming down the track and know that at some point it is going to derail. The question is when. So Charles Merrill, who co-founded Merrill Lynch famously, in 1928 told all of his clients the stock market was severely overvalued and everybody should get out of the market. Well, from the beginning of 1928 to September of 1929, the stock market went up 90%. And so this is sort of the great complicating factor. I think people know intuitively that things can be overvalued, but sometimes these things can go on for quite some time. Paul Tudor Jones, who's a famous hedge fund trader today, did an interview with me that seemed to go viral a couple months ago where he said, I think we're in September of 1999. And a lot of people said, ooh, September 1999 sounds terrible because that was when the dot-com boom and bust happened, except for the fact that the stock market, by the way, after September of 1999, before it went bust, went up by 40%. Right. And so it's very hard to say, take your money out. And now I'm going to be speaking against my book. I think a lot of people think the book is a warning of sorts, or it's to suggest these Cassandras are right. The Cassandras are right. They're just not always right about the timing. And the truth is, depending on what your time horizon is, most people who sort of closed their eyes over the last 100 years did a lot. It was a lot more profitable to be an optimist than a pessimist. And that's the complicating factor of all of this.
Yeah, the timing thing is, the great Twain line, the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, but Mark Twain did die, right? So
it'll happen.
Yeah, it'll happen. So you.
Yes.
How did you come to be you? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? When did you decide to know this much about business, which intimidates the rest of us?
So, grew up in New York City till I was 7, then moved to Scarsdale, New York, which is in Westchester outside of New York City.
What did the parents do?
My dad, this will explain a lot, antitrust lawyer. My mother is a playwright. So if you could put those two together, it might explain a little bit of how it all happened. When I was 15 years old, though, I didn't necessarily want to be a journalist. I was fascinated by media and by television and by just all that magazines.
You were 15, like what, 3 years ago?
No, I'm 48 now.
But wow.
And I was fascinated. I loved all of this stuff. And when I was 15 years old, I decided to start a sports magazine at my high school, not because I wanted to necessarily write about sports. I find writing, by the way, just to be candid, very hard. I have visions of you, playing the keyboard like a piano, of cackling to yourself. I find it very painful. I sit there hunting and pecking, and I
do cackle.
You do cackle.
Yeah.
But I started this magazine in part because I thought I could sell advertising. So I was fascinated also by the business side of all of this. And the magazine, we tried to turn it into a national magazine briefly.
What was the magazine called?
It was called the Sports Page Magazine. My first interview in my life was with David Stern, the old great David Stern, who was the commissioner of the NBA. And anyway, the magazine failed by the time I was 18. However, I used to read a guy named Stuart Elliott at the New York Times. He had a column. He was the advertising columnist at the New York Times. Most people read the front page or the sports page. I went to page C6 in the business section and read Stuart, because my mother would drive me to New York City on Friday afternoons, where I'd go to the advertising agencies and try to sell ads for the magazine, and I wanted to act like I knew what I was talking about. So when I was 18 years old, I thought, I got to get a job with this guy, Stuart Elliott. And so I used to call him and leave these voicemails at his office. I'd go home during lunch to call to see if I could somehow get a meeting with this man. And I must have done this and wrote him letters. Finally, I go home one day to make one of these lunchtime calls, and he picks up the phone. I literally thought God was on the other end of the line. I almost put the phone down. I explained who I was, and he says, I can't give you an internship or anything, but why don't you come and have lunch with me, and I'll take you on a tour of the building. And this was like nirvana. And I convinced him, I was still in high school, to let me come for 5 weeks for free at the New York Times to basically Xerox and staple and get coffee for him, which was more than enough. And the third week I was there, a great editor named Felicity Barringer, who actually lives out in California now, didn't know how old I was. I was in the building, had a suit on. I think I was wearing a tie. She overheard me talking about this thing called the internet, and she assigned me a story to write. And I went back to Stuart and explained I was just assigned to, and he said, you got to go tell her you can't do this. You haven't even graduated from high school. You got to just tell her what's going on here. And I said, why don't you let me try to write the story? The assignment was 500 words. I wrote the story.
What year was this?
This is 1995. I wrote the story. I showed it to my mother first. I gave it to Stuart. He fixed it up a little bit. They published it in the paper the next Monday. And that's how my career began.
You were how old, 18?
I was 18 years old. I went off to Cornell University. And then when I was a junior, for part of the year, I was at the London School of Economics in London. And the business editor called me and said, what time is school finished for you? And I said, about 2:30. He said, oh, that's great. That's like 9:30 in New York. Could you write articles for us in the afternoons? So I would go to school in the morning, and then I would go to the bureau in the afternoons, and I'd write articles about business. And so when I graduated, they sent me back to London, and I covered business, and all the big mergers and acquisitions were happening in Wall Street at the sort of the end of the 99, 2000. 2001. 2001, I started this thing called Deal Book at the New York Times, and kept doing it.
It's amazing. It's amazing. So basically, we need to get our mothers to drive us into Manhattan.
Yes.
I like that.
Yeah, that's how it happened.
What surprised you the most in the research? Was there I know you followed the money.
You know,
but was there an aha moment? Like, oh, I didn't even know this.
There were so many aha moments. I love characters. I am enamored by people. That's, to me, the way I've sort of approached business. I've never thought about business as numbers or economic cycles. I believe people make decisions that create economic cycles, that institutions are made up of people, and trying just to understand who they were and why they were doing it. I think my surprise was a combination of how much, frankly, manipulation was going on during that period, and the idea that they all thought it was okay. And I think they genuinely thought it was okay. So interestingly, back in 1929, there was no SEC, there were no laws, there were no rules. There was insider trading was legal. This was completely an acceptable form of behavior. There were no bank capital requirements. There was none of it. And the thing that today, with hindsight, you look at a lot of these things and you go, "This seems completely illegal, immoral. How could this be?" And when you really look, I was looking desperately to find any information from any characters in this space who said, "You know what? I'm not going to participate in this because what's going on here is totally immoral." They didn't see it that way. No. And the stock market is a very funny thing because it really is a business of people who think that it's a business of wits. Somebody's outwitting the other person, right? Whoever's buying a stock in that moment thinks that they are smarter than the person selling them the stock. You have to. And if you're selling the stock, you think you're smarter than the person buying the stock. And so back then, I think a lot of when you saw these kind of manipulative efforts, a lot of them saw all of this as just another form of outwitting the other side. And but it's so interesting to then watch how, afterwards, we as a culture and a society decide what we think is right and wrong and how that effectively develops, if you will.
Right. So talk about the SEC.
Yeah.
And there was the creation out of this crisis of more of a moral climate.
Yes.
Or at least the outward
absolutely
appearance of it.
Right.
And I think I'm right that FDR thought that putting Joe Kennedy at the SEC was like putting the bank robber in charge of security.
Yes, that was sort of the concept.
Yeah.
So the SEC was created 1934. By the way, Glass-Steagall was created in 1933, so the banks get broken up in effectively 33. At the same time, we got FDIC insurance for the first time, which was also a very important element of all this because people then weren't having bank runs. People felt finally confident that the money in the bank could stay there. That was a huge piece of this. And by the way, Roosevelt and Hoover did not want to do that, interestingly, from a political perspective, because they believed that a bank, for example, wouldn't behave properly, that it was actually, the distinction between a good bank and a bad bank, if the government was backing all of them, would actually lead to...
It took away the incentive.
Exactly, lead banks to make poor decisions. The SEC's creation, I think, really did end some of the insider trading and some of the worst of the worst. I mean, actions. I mean, back then there was something called investment pools, where you had people almost like actors on the floor of the stock exchange, where everybody was in cahoots with each other, trying to run stocks up and down and pull the rug. I mean, it was really quite remarkable, but they all thought that was okay. And then, and by the way, in 1940, you had bank capital requirements through the Bank Act. So those things, I think, have helped prevent the worst of the worst kinds of things from happening. But the truth is, and I sort of try to suggest this at the end of the book, human nature is such that everybody's always trying to get around the rules and create new rules. And that seems to be what happens in almost every cycle.
So, double-barreled question.
Please.
What worries you the most?
Right.
And what makes you hopeful?
What worries me the most actually is us, our own human nature. I think that there's a scene, I don't know if you ever saw this movie, it's not a great movie, Wall Street 2, not the first Wall Street, but Wall Street 2.
Oh, the big phone?
Well, the big phone was Michael Douglas in the first one. Oliver Stone did it. There was a Wall Street 2 that also had Michael Douglas in it, but also had Shia LaBeouf. I don't know if you remember.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a scene in it where Shia LaBeouf is talking, I can't really think of the other actor's name, and they say, "What's your number?" As in, what would make you whole? What would make you feel financially independent? What would just make you say, I got to the top of the mountain, I'm going to go ski down now, I'm done? And there's sort of a pause in the scene, and he looks back and he says, more. That's my number. My number's more. And I think that represents us. We all want more. And I think that is a sort of a natural human impulse. But I also think in an age and moment of the inequality that we have in the country and everything else, there is a rush to want not just more, but the lottery ticket. This was a phenomenon also in the 20s, that the American dream shifted in some ways to capturing the lottery ticket, and the things that people will do and the risk that people will take to get that lottery ticket. That is what scares me, probably more than anything else. I often find myself almost in a paternalistic way, in some of my writing in the New York Times, sometimes on CNBC, trying to warn the public about SPACs, which was a blank check operation that a lot of Wall Street folks were running a couple years ago, or different sort of financial products in the market that I thought could be considered too risky for the public. And invariably, one of the things that I keep finding is I get letters and emails and texts and tweets from people who say, Andrew, stop trying to protect me. You're not protecting me. In fact, you're protecting the man. We want that. We want the risk. We want that opportunity. And so I think people think that they want that, but invariably I think when things go wrong...
Until they lose, yeah.
Then they don't. The other thing, by the way, just as a side note to this, that actually was a revelation for me. After the financial crisis, 2008, there was a lot of finger pointing. Blamed the banks, we blamed the regulators, we blamed policy, we blamed all sorts of things. We did not blame ourselves. In 1929, if you go back and really read the diaries of ordinary Americans who participated in what was the bubble of that stock market, so many of them blamed themselves. They actually didn't blame the bankers. They didn't blame the markets. They didn't blame anything else. They thought it was their fault. And I think that actually speaks also volumes about sort of a cultural shift. And that's not to say, by the way, that they weren't being manipulated either by some of the bankers. It wasn't really until 1932 that there was even a conversation about blaming the bankers and blaming Wall Street. We're having a conversation, I think, in America today about capitalism versus socialism. I live in New York City. I just interviewed Mayor Mamdani. That conversation was not happening in the aftermath, really, of 1929.
Hopeful.
I am hopeful.
Don't like that pause.
No. I'll tell you why I'm hopeful. And it's not a blind hope, but the truth is, as I said before, being a Cassandra has not been typically the most profitable way to live your life. I think there really is some magic about the optimism that's taken place and the true track record and success of this country. We are better today than we were 10 years ago and 20 years before that. And I think we are on I hope, a path that continues forward. But it is just so clear to me, despite all of my hand-wringing, it's funny, being a journalist is, to some degree, requires you to be a professional skeptic. That kind of is the job. But I hope that the public are professional optimists in a way. And I think that Americans are optimists, and I think that optimism does hopefully lead to a better place.
Andrew Ross Sorkin, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and silence all cell phones. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Doris Kerns Goodwin and Ryan Holiday.
Wow. Well, it's lovely to be here. I'm a huge fan. This is a complete honor for me.
Me too, you. So this is cool.
Well, I was thinking as I was preparing for this, there's something I read about Churchill where right as he's coming back into power and Germany is on the march, he was still finishing up one of the volumes of his History of the English-Speaking Peoples. And he's writing a letter to his agent, and he says something like, "It's good to have 1,000 years of distance between me and the present moment." And I was thinking about that and thinking about Lincoln, who we're going to talk about today. It probably does say something that it's relaxing and calming to read about the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. But it is. There's something about Team of Rivals that just it kind of restores your faith in humanity a little bit.
I think there's no question about that. I mean, it's kind of odd that I've spent my career studying the Civil War, the tumult at the turn of the 20th century, the Great Depression, and World War II, but I feel better being back in those times. The main reason you feel better is that you know how they ended. We don't know that. We feel the anxiety. They didn't know they were going to win World War II, the Allies. They didn't know that the Union would be restored and emancipation secured. They didn't know that the Depression would come to an end. We know that. So that's why we have to get strength from having been through those tough times before, but nothing more than Lincoln, I think. As you say, there's something about his person. We've talked a little bit. We had a podcast on Lincoln. I felt like I was talking to somebody who knew him as well. It was so much fun. But it's not just what he did, win the war and preserve the Union and emancipate the slaves. It's who he was. That's the thing. There was something about him. When I first was asked to think about a book about Lincoln, I was so scared because I hadn't even done the 19th century. So I went to see the great Lincoln scholar, David Donald, and he lived on Lincoln Road in Lincoln, Massachusetts. Anyway, he had a whole library, and he showed me that, and I said, "I'm nervous about this." He said, "You will never regret living with Lincoln. You'll feel like you're a better person at the end." And I really did feel that way. And then when Steven Spielberg decided to do the movie and Daniel Day-Lewis decided to portray Lincoln, I told them that. And definitely Daniel said, I mean, having been Billy the Butcher for a while and all these other characters, to live with Lincoln, you somehow feel like you have the ordinary human emotions that your guys all talk about of anger and jealousy and envy, but somehow they'll poison you if you let them fester. So every time one of those comes, I think, Abe is here telling me, who cares about jealousy? You can't control what's happening to somebody else.
Yeah, and I imagine that reading and studying the past was not just a way for Lincoln to get through his difficult childhood, but he's also reading during the Civil War. You know, there's that famous scene, I think, right before he tells his cabinet about the Emancipation Proclamation. He's reading a chapter from Artemus Ward or something. He finds something incredibly soothing and reassuring about high and lowbrow literature.
Right, he loved Shakespeare's comedies as much as he loved Shakespeare's tragedies, and he used to read Shakespeare's comedies to his young aides, Nicolay and Hay, at night, so that instead of thinking about the war and the number of people who died that day, the comedy would be in his head, and he could just imagine what Shakespeare was talking about, and he could laugh to himself. He said, you know, he whistled off sadness through laughter, that a good story was better for him than a drop of whiskey. So humor was a huge part of his life. I don't think I knew that when I started. I knew he'd be a great statesman, a great politician, but I don't think I realized how much I'd be laughing with him, because he doesn't look like he laughs, except when he laughed, his whole body changed, evidently. You know, that sort of sad expression in his face, which was just his face, you know, it suddenly came to life.
Yeah, I think there's something there for people. It's so easy to get trapped in your phone, whether you're doom scrolling or you're just reading endless amounts of news. Obviously, it's the job of the citizen to be informed, but I think sometimes we over-index for real-time breaking news, which obviously Lincoln, you know, he's going down to the telegraph office to get it straight from the ballot. So he's one of the first generations of people that could get real-time breaking news, and it's always going to be horrible information for him. And yet he's going 500 years back with Shakespeare, or he's going 1,000 years back with philosophy, or there's something, I think he's trying to root himself in the timeless human experience rather than just Antietam or Gettysburg or whatever.
Yeah, I think you almost have to do that. You have to just remember what human nature is. and what people have been through. And Lincoln took great solace in, and reading, I mean, from the time he was little, he had only 1 year of formal schooling, as you know, and somehow he had to get it on. You had something you said, but he had to get his education, right? What was that comment you made? It was such a good one.
Yeah, nobody gave it to him. He had to go get it.
He had to go get it. And that makes all the difference. That means you don't feel like you're finished with your education when you finish college or you finish high school. You have to do it your whole life. And he was able to, when he couldn't get books because his father would take the books away from him, there weren't books in his neighborhood, he would walk miles in order to get a book. And then he would say that when he got a copy of King James Bible or Shakespeare's plays, he was so excited he couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. Emily Dickinson once said, or wrote, that there's nothing like a frigate, no frigate like a book to take you lands away, which meant that he was able to imagine another way of, how did this kid growing up in this poor area where nobody's ambitions went much beyond, or he thought they didn't, beyond where, to imagine that he could have another way of life. Nothing saddened him more. He one time saw an unmarked grave, and he said, who knows who's laying there? It could be somebody with talent that wasn't exercised. And that was part of his definition of democracy, that democracy should be able to make us rise to the level of our talent and discipline. You can't give a person more talent necessarily, but they can expand it and develop it, and you can't give them more discipline if they're not going to work hard. But democracy should allow it that everybody, because he felt that sense, he was lucky enough that he was able to do that.
And Lincoln's obviously famous for his self-education as a young boy. He's reading, he's carving down sentences that he hears on pieces of wood because he can't even afford paper. But I think there's sort of two pivotal moments that I think there's a lesson in leadership there. One, in his life, one is right when sort of the popular sovereignty, the sort of suddenly slavery is on the march. And Lincoln, he'd always been opposed to slavery at this sort of visceral moral level, but he realizes that he doesn't know that much about the history of it. And he goes to the State House, he goes to the Library of Congress, and he just decides he's going to read everything he can about it. What do the founders say? And then the second moment is when he is president, and suddenly this war is thrust upon him, and he realizes, his 45 days in the Black Hawk War are not sufficient experience to lead what is going to be the largest army in the world. So he has to go, and he had this. He could do deep dives. He'd go, I don't know about this. I'm gonna know everything there is to know about this, and that process is fascinating to me.
I mean, you mentioned the idea of not feeling like, how can I possibly deal with a war when I've only had this short experience? And he felt that most acutely the night he was elected. He couldn't sleep. He said that he realized he'd only had 1 year in Congress, 1 term in Congress, and a few terms in the state legislature, and the country was already splitting apart. And the most terrible war we'd ever have would begin soon thereafter. And it was that night that he made the decision to put his 3 chief rivals into his cabinet. Before dawn, he had made that critical decision that defined everything. And each one thought he was more powerful than Lincoln. Each one thought he was more celebrated, and they were. Each one was more educated. Each one thought he should be president instead of Abraham Lincoln. And his friend said to him, Lincoln, you can't do this. You're going to look like a figurehead with all these powerful people around you. And he said, you're wrong. The country's in peril. These are the strongest and most able people in the country. I need them by my side. But I always tease that my good friend Lyndon Johnson would have put that same concept in less noble language. He liked to say it's better to have your enemies inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing
in. He had a hunger to learn. There's a passage in Meditations where Marcus Aurelius thanks his philosophy teacher for teaching him never to be satisfied with just getting the gist of things.
Wow.
And Lincoln was never satisfied with getting the gist of things. I think Herndon said he had to get to the nub of it.
Yeah.
And that's what's so interesting about his understanding of slavery. And then you see it most eloquently. I don't think people think of the Gettysburg Address as this work of oratory, but it's also this work of sort of scholarship, and it's a legal argument that he is the result of those hours and hours and hours of research as to what the founders thought about this issue.
And the interesting thing, when he comes up finally with the Emancipation Proclamation, it was possible because he had left the White House to go to the soldiers' home, which was miles away, and he had the capacity there for reflection, which is what your guys always talk about.
Sure.
His guys. I mean, he's got these guys. He probably knows Marcus Aurelius and lived with him as much as I lived with Abraham Lincoln. And I've just been reading your stuff now. It's astonishing how much stoicism seems to apply to Lincoln. I mean, is that just because you do that, or I mean, I never thought of that until I've been reading what you've been doing.
I would have loved to find some overt connection between Lincoln and some of those ancients. We don't see much. My favorite Lincoln story and the ancient authors, though, is the one about him and Plutarch. Do you know this one?
I don't know if I do.
So someone's writing a campaign biography of Lincoln, and they're trying to make him sound more educated than he was. He didn't go to school, but he read this and he read this, and he says, and one of his favorite authors is Plutarch, and the great biographer. And Lincoln hasn't read Plutarch. And so he reads the biography, and so he calls to go get a copy of Plutarch, which he reads to thus make the biography true. And it does become one of his favorite books.
Wow, I don't know that I know that. That's great.
It's, don't pretend you've read it, go read it, I think is the lesson there.
No, I mean, reading, it's just so heartbreaking when you think about today's world. I mean, we're in the middle of a library, and how great to be able to see all these books around us, and our kids still feeling that same sense of holding a book and the glory of taking it to bed with you at night, and not just getting a part of it. That I hear sometimes that in high schools now, they're not having people read whole books, that they're reading pieces. You don't get it if you don't read the whole of it, and because you immerse yourself in it. It's an experience, it's a journey with that author.
Well, the amount, so one of your books, it looks big, but that's actually a distillation of, years and years of work, thousands of hours. And so when you think about what a book contains, what a magical piece of technology it is, the compression of all this time and energy and experience, it's kind of amazing that people don't take advantage of it.
Yeah, my only worry is that the fattest book I wrote was on Theodore Roosevelt and Taft and the golden age of journalism, and a woman wrote me that she was reading it at night at bed, and she fell asleep and it broke her nose. So after that, I've tried to slim them down. So my desire to have big books, maybe I'm going down.
Yeah, but the ability to say, hey, I'm going to go figure this thing out from top to bottom. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how you do that with your books, because I think we're entering this world of AI where people think it's you write a query into ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, and it'll tell you everything you need to know, as if the summary is what's important and not the process of going through the whole thing.
Yeah, what I always do when I start a new subject is to write a proposal for what it is that I want to know, because the trouble is, once you get into a book, sometimes you get taken down avenues, and maybe you're the only one that cares about it. There was a whole chapter in the Taft book about the tariff, which was pretty sexy at the time and seems to be sexy again now, but I don't know that people really wanted to know that much about the tariffs. You have to.
I would like to not have to know about tariffs.
Exactly so. But the process of writing, you said something that I thought was so important. He was talking about the whole ritual of the day, and you, like me, wake up early in the morning. The morning is the best hours because nothing can intrude, and you feel like I wake up at 5:30, and that time when my husband was still alive, that time between 5:30 and 8 or so, when he'd wake up, come down the stairs singing, and I knew that was the end of my writing for a little while. Then we'd have breakfast, read the papers. He'd go to his study, I'd go to mine. But now I just feel like that's that time when creative thoughts are right there. And then you said something too about the fact that the best time when you're writing a book is when you're just writing it, when it's just yours and you have control over it. Once it goes out, and it's exciting when it goes out and you're on a book tour, but then there's an anxiety connected to it, which isn't there when you're writing. So my favorite time is just being in the middle of a book.
Yes, I think there's something special about the morning, which unfortunately there is the temptation to ruin. Like how many days are ruined before people's feet hit the floor because they reached for their phone and were informed what so-and-so tweeted or what so-and-so from work emailed them. Like, I think protecting that space for that reflection, the world has always been busy, but we uniquely have access to everything that's happened in the world while we're asleep. I'm not sure that's the best and most productive way to spend those golden hours of the morning.
Absolutely. That you have a sense then of you're living with the person you're writing about, or whatever the thing is you're writing. They're with you. They're right there in the room.
Yes.
And if you bring somebody else into the room, then you're taking away that relationship. That sounds crazy, but I really do. when I wake up, I think about the guys I'm writing about. I think about them when they go to bed at night. So they're part of my life. You know, I've lived with, and I sometimes feel when I move my books out of one biography that I'm writing and I move them out of the study to make room for the next guy, that I'm leaving an old boyfriend behind, that you feel like, what am I doing? This is unfair. But that's the glory of being able to spend so much time on these books.
The founding story of Stoicism is about this guy named Zeno in the 4th century BC, and he's a merchant, and he stops in Delphi, and he goes up to visit the oracle. So he winds his way up this sacred road, and he washes his hand in the spring, and he lights the incense, and then he asks the oracle, what the secret to the good life is. And the oracle goes back, and she huffs these fumes that come up from the ground and gets really high. That's where the mysterious prophecies from the oracle would come from. And she comes back and she says, the secret to wisdom and the good life is to have conversations with the dead. And he doesn't know what this means until many years later. He's walking through the Athenian Agora, and he hears someone reading a story that's from Socrates, I guess Socrates via Plato. And he realizes in this moment that that's what reading is.
Wow.
It's a way to have conversations with the dead. And I think there's something about, the wisdom of the past, whether it's Lincoln or Johnson or Roosevelt, that it seems weird that we would, not that people alive today aren't wonderful, but that we wouldn't want to sample from the wisdom of these people that came before us.
And the corollary that on the other side is, just as we the living want to get wisdom from the past, we the living hope that our stories will be told in the future.
Sure.
I mean, that's certainly what was a huge impetus for Lincoln. We've talked about this moment when he had a Great Depression. He had broken his engagement with Mary Todd, and his most important character trait, he thought, was keeping his word. And he had so humiliated her. His best friend, Joshua Speed, was leaving town, and he said, if you have friends, you're going to lose them, but if you don't have them, you're going to be sad. And then his whole infrastructure project had fallen apart, and he was so sad that people took all knives and razors and scissors from his room. And his friend Joshua Speed said to him, Lincoln, you must rally or you will die. And he said, I know that, and I might just as soon die now, but I've not yet accomplished anything to make any human being remember that I have lived. I mean, I think all of us have that desire to have our story told after we die. It may be to our family, to our friends, to our colleagues, or it may be in history. But that's how you live on. Just as the dead live on as we read them now, we're going to live on when people think about us or to talk about us.
Yeah, codifying the lessons of your own life and putting it in some form that other people can benefit from them I think that's what motivates us all as writers at some level.
Oh, I think that's really right. I think about the last book I wrote on the unfinished love story with my husband. I was so sad at the thought whether I could work on it or not, because it would make me miss him all the more, because we were going to do it together, until I realized that he'll be with me. He's with me. In fact, here I am talking about him again. Richard Goodwin, there you're alive again. But I think more importantly, it's just that you want people to know that what kind of person you are. Again, it's not just what you did. I mean, you'd hope they'd say that when I think about the qualities of leadership that Lincoln had, he had humility and empathy and resilience and accountability and taking responsibility and kindness and compassion and an ambition for something that was larger than himself. You hope that about yourself, that people will say you were kind and had compassion and you had empathy and humility. Those are the central human qualities that make a person good. And they also may, in Lincoln's case, make a person great.
The other parallel I was thinking to this sort of moment in time with Lincoln, there's this technology that's sort of going around at that time. There was the Mechanical Turk. People believed there was this chess-playing machine. And it turns out there was a man inside playing chess, and that's why he was so good. But the story, I think it was a governor of Kentucky. Someone comes to visit Lincoln right as the Civil War is breaking out. And they ask Lincoln, do you have a message for the people down in Kentucky or whatever it is? And he stands up and he says, let them know there's a man in here.
Wow.
And
wow.
I think about his confidence. The greatest crisis in American history falls on his shoulders. and he says, I think I can handle this. Where does that come from?
Yeah, it's so amazing. I mean, David Donald, again, that scholar, he said that he thought the confidence came from the fact that in school, in his limited schooling, he was always by far ahead of everybody else in the class in terms of reading, understanding, and just, again, the person he was. So he knew that. He knew that from his, but somehow, and I think maybe his stepmother gave it to him, maybe his mother to a certain extent before she died. He knew that she'd been loved, even though the relationship with the father was so troubling. But that combination of confidence and humility, that's what's so special in him.
Yes.
Because he's humble enough to know to surround himself with all these characters, but he's confident enough to know, I'm going to make them a team and I'm going to be their leader. How does he think that? I mean, they are world-class figures already, and he's barely known. But it was inside him, that confidence.
Yeah, there's something about the confidence and humility that is an antidote to ego, which you so often see in leaders and heads of state. He's hungry and humble enough to know, I don't know this, I have to learn it. And then when he learns it, though, he's willing to bet on himself or willing to stand alone when everyone else thinks all is lost.
Yeah, he later said that he never doubted for a moment that we would eventually win the war, despite all of the difficulties that he went through, that somehow he had a faith that it was right to win the war. And once especially it became a moral... Right, exactly. Right makes right. When it became the emancipation that he was fighting for, as well as the Union, then somehow that greater moral value would work. There were forces in the society. He would often talk about things... control me, I don't control them. He had that sense, I think, that there are things out there and all you can do is whatever your big thing, or Marcus is, I think of him as Marcus Aurelius now, right, that you have to accept what you can't control. What is that saying exactly?
Well, Stoicism is you don't control what happens, you control how you respond to what happens. Exactly. Yeah, I think, doesn't Lincoln say too that he's like a ship His time on the Mississippi River is so formative, but he says, I'm like a captain. I sail from point to point. So he had this sense of where he wanted to go, but he's able to break it up in these sort of composite tasks that make maybe the whole thing seem less daunting and overwhelming.
And I think what he was also able to do was to master himself, which you and Marcus talk about. I mean, at night, in addition to going to talk and the comedies of Shakespeare, he would do pardons at night because somehow pardoning a soldier who had run away from fear, or a soldier who had fallen asleep on checkpoint duty who was about to be killed for that, made him feel, I've saved somebody's life, and as long as they go back to the war, they can have honor again, and then their families will be proud of them, and then he could go to sleep again. So there was a sense of knowing what he needed to soothe himself, like he was his own psychiatrist in a peculiar way.
You could imagine it going a different way for Lincoln, though. He has this hard childhood. He's basically abused by his father. Nobody gives him anything. It's one tragedy after another. He has to claw his way up effectively from nothing. You could imagine that creating a hard-hearted person, right? And just like there were so many Americans who were that way, I do sometimes wonder if life was so hard, that's what made it hard for people to be sympathetic to people who had it harder than them at that time. Wow, but for Lincoln, it's the opposite. From his suffering came this profound compassion, this well of empathy, and it doesn't always happen that way.
Without a question. I mean, one of the things I think about him at the beginning of his life, he had that humility. Really, even early young, he was able to say, I don't know grammar. I mean, he was embarrassed. And then he found out that there was this book he could get that he would learn grammar. And more importantly, I think that humility, as we say, is combined with confidence. But then at the end of his presidency, that's where you see the empathy really come out. Everybody had gone through this terrible war. After Appomattox, there was a rush on to hang the people who'd been in the Confederate Army or the Confederate government and put them on trial, and retribution and vindictiveness and retaliation. And Lincoln understood that feeling in the people's minds, but he said, we can't have any more hate. We've got to move forward. I mean, we need that feeling so much today. The idea of living back on vindictiveness and retaliation and retribution, and that's what he says will poison you. And somehow he was able to do that too. I mean, I keep remembering his first big handbill remember when he was 23 and he ran for office the first time. And in it he says, I'm so familiar with disappointment that if the good people decide not to vote for me, I'll understand it. I'm familiar with it. But then he says, but if I do lose, I'm going to come back 5 or 6 times until it's too embarrassing, and then I promise you I won't come back again. And that's an amazing combination, that thing. And he also said, even then, every man has his peculiar ambition. He's saying this at 23 years old. Mine is to be esteemed of by my fellow man for having achieved something important. And he had that desire. A lot of people in power, they get it later in life. I interviewed Obama, President Obama, when he was leaving the presidency, and he knew about that peculiar ambition thing. He said, I'm not sure at 23 that I had that kind of ambition to do something larger than myself. Yeah. I mean, maybe I wanted to accomplish something to make my absent father feel proud, or because of being a mixed race person. But it was only later that the ambition got attached to something where you could make a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, it seems like the presidents tackle that in the second term.
Yeah.
The big projects, right?
Yeah. Then they start thinking, what's my legacy going to be?
Yes, and Lincoln thought about that early.
Yeah.
There's something in Lincoln where he, because of the suffering, he both accepts that the suffering and pain is an inevitable part of life, and yet does seem to have this desire to alleviate it in others when he can, whether it's the pardons or, sort of letting things go. That is probably what I admire most about him. That because despite all the blows of fate landing upon him, he stayed decent and kind and compassionate.
Yeah, there's very few times when he hated meanness in anybody. When he was pardoning the soldiers, that was the one thing he wouldn't pardon them for, if they were mean. And when he would go, he went to the active battlefield more than a dozen times because he wanted to walk amidst the wounded. He wanted to visit them in the hospital. He wanted to sustain their morale. But more importantly, he would say he got his own morale boosted because of seeing them. And the relationship he developed with the soldiers who themselves were suffering and gave them the impetus to keep wanting to fight. They knew when they went to the election in 1864 that voting for Lincoln meant the war would be extended, because McClellan, who he was running against, good old General McClellan, who never moved his army anywhere. Lincoln always said, well, have you created a stationary army? When McClellan said, I have horses that are tired, he said, what have your horses been doing? They haven't been moving. But anyway, McClellan, he drove me crazy. But anyway, he's running against Lincoln in 1864, and he's sort of promising an earlier peace. So those soldiers know that by voting for, and everybody thought McClellan would absolutely get the votes because he had been a popular general of the soldiers, and Lincoln cared most about the soldiers' vote than anything else. And when he got the news that night that 7 out of 10 soldiers had voted for him, that he said that mattered to him more than winning the election did, and that he said that he knew that then that the cause that they were fighting together, they believed in the cause that he believed in, and they'd become together in that. And that was the best. I think before he died, that probably mattered as much to him as winning the war.
One of the things we do about historical figures is we sort of make them into these myths or these legends. But of course, they are human beings. And it's like if Lincoln was naturally this way, it would be less impressive. Part of it is that there was a lot of work under the surface. Like we would love to think about him as, fundamentally magnanimous, patient, kind, never holds grudges, never gets mad. But underneath there was a man with a temper, a man who got upset, a man who had his ambition. I think about those letters that he would write and then put in his desk drawer.
Oh yeah.
So there's something too about Lincoln where he's having the fundamentally human response, but then he's got the self-mastery to stop himself before he, hit send.
Exactly. That's two things, actually. One is that when he was young, he was a great debater, and he could be hard on the people he was working with. And so there was a Democrat when he was a Whig, and he so skewered him in a contest between the two that he made fun of the way he walked, the way he talked, that everybody started laughing. And the skinning of Thomas, his name was Jesse Thomas, was a laughter in the town, and Thomas started crying. And Lincoln realized, I've done something terribly wrong. He went to his house that night and apologized. But more importantly, he said to himself, I'm never going to use my wit and humor to hurt somebody deliberately again. But then you're right. Then what happens during the war, when General Meade failed to follow up with General Lee's army after the battle at Gettysburg, he was so depressed about it, because if he'd gotten Lee's army, the war might have been over. But he didn't get Lee's army, and he wrote him this long letter saying, "I'm immeasurably distressed. You didn't do what we asked you to do. The war might have come to an earlier end. Now it's going to go on month after month, year after year." But then he knew it would paralyze the general in the field, and he put it aside, and it was never sent. And then you find in his letters, never sent and never signed, a whole bunch of these things where he'd get mad at somebody. And that's why it's so great. I got a letter from a CEO of a company after Team of Rivals came out, said that he had heard his subordinate had done something bad, and he had written a long email to him. And then he just decided, because he'd read Lincoln, put it in save rather than send. And he found out the next morning that his information wasn't right.
Yes.
So he said, "Lincoln saved me."
Yeah, the ability to pause and reflect before doing the thing, that's kind of his superpower. And I guess, I mean, it's a little easier in a world where it's less instantaneous, but you could argue this is so much more important now. I think about, like the Cuban Missile Crisis happening over 13 days.
Right.
It would happen in 13 minutes now.
Exactly.
And just the speed at which things are happening makes it really hard for those better angels to take control.
I think, interestingly, Lincoln, even though he was a great debater, I mean, when he debated with Stephen Douglas, he could be funny. At one point, somebody said to him, "Lincoln, you're two-faced," and his immediate response was, "If I had two faces, do you think I'd be wearing this face?" I mean, he was able to do, but once he became president, he never wanted to speak extemporaneously. I don't think he would be a tweeter today.
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt, I can see him doing it, because he was so good at those short, speak softly and carry a big stick, don't hit until you have to. He even gave Maxwell House the slogan, "Good to the very last drop." So he'd be great at all that. But Lincoln, even when the Union would win a battle and they'd come to serenade him, and he would stand on the balcony, and they'd be singing songs, and he'd just say, "Let's sing songs and praise the soldiers." And they'd say, "Speech, speech." And he'd say, "No, I have to wait until I'm ready." Because he said words can hurt as well as heal. Words can divide as well as unite. So that would be a lesson for everybody today, who just talks immediately and then tries to take it back and then says, "I never said it in the first place." And then the whole idea of truth is undone today.
I think Lincoln, properly understood, is a writer. He's not an orator. Apparently the speeches weren't that great. What he was saying was incredible, and it's because he so belabored every detail and every word. He had both like the lawyer's mind and then the poet and the writer's mind, and so his arguments were just so tight. And you're right, he's never winging it.
Right, never. It was always thought that he wrote the Gettysburg Address on a piece of paper on his way to the cemetery, and that's completely untrue. He had been thinking about it, and he would make little notes, and he'd put them in one of those desks that you have, with the little things. I love those desks. Yeah. And then he'd bring them out when it was time to do it. So he labored over everything he wrote.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's sort of a predecessor of the Gettysburg Address where he was riffing, like they came to the White House and sort of demanded a speech, and he gave a somewhat extemporaneous version of some of the ideas in the Gettysburg Address. And then when you read the Gettysburg Address, you go, "Oh, this is why this is the most famous speech of all time," because he'd worked on it. And he got it perfect. And that distillation, I think makes all writers jealous. The guy that speaks before Lincoln talks for like 2 hours. Lincoln speaks for 2 minutes, and we remember one and not the other because it's about the restraint and it's about the refining and the compression.
Well, that's the poet in him. I mean, poetry somehow is able to take something big and feelings and just compress it into a few lines, which is amazing. I wish I could do that. Then nobody would be getting their nose broken by what I was writing.
That line about I would have written a shorter letter if I could, but I wasn't a good enough writer.
Just to go back to what you started off with, Churchill, the other great thing he said is, "I think history's going to treat me well because I intend to write it."
Yes.
I'd love to have known him as well. Oh my God. There's an interesting jealousy because I was talking about this last night at dinner, but Franklin Roosevelt wondered how many speechwriters Churchill had, and he sent Harry Hopkins over to meet Churchill before he first was going to meet him himself. And Hopkins came back and said, no, it's really just him. He sits in the bathtub and he speaks out loud. And Roosevelt had a series of writers working for him. So somehow there was something about Churchill's ability to write as he did that Roosevelt admired greatly.
Well, and that was honed by the fact that it was his job, and he'd spent most of his adult life communicating with the public, which is actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about. What's so amazing about Lincoln is not just his moral sense and vision, but his ability to communicate that to the public. What's incredible about the Gettysburg Address is that he's redefining what America is, what the Civil War is about, in so few sentences, and yet everyone sort of agrees with it. Like, right. His ability to communicate effectively is just as essential as his ability to be right about those issues.
You know, I hadn't thought about it till you just said it, but I think the reason he's able to communicate so effectively is because he was sensing where the public was every day. I mean, people would come in the mornings and they would be able to talk to him about wanting a job as a postmaster or a clerk. And after a while, Nicolay and Hay, again, these young A's, said, Mr. Lincoln, you don't have time for these ordinary people. He said, you're wrong. These are my public opinion baths. I must never forget the popular assemblage.
His social media.
Exactly. I never forget the popular assemblage from which I have come. And then he would read the newspapers. He would go to the battlefields, as I said. He would constantly have people in. So he was sensing public opinion, and he could sense the shifts in it. At first, it didn't seem like they could allow black people to go into the army because the white generals wouldn't allow it, or people would desert as a result. But then, as he saw what was happening when blacks did get into the army, and they fought so well, then he realized this was maybe one of the most important things he did, and people's opinions had shifted. So the ability to communicate is not just with words; it's where is the public now, and where do I want to move the public?
Right.
But you have to know where they are to know where to move them.
Yeah, it's like if Churchill shapes this through his writing, his speeches, and then his radio program, which people don't understand, he was more popular in America than he was in his own country because of radio. Lincoln, I guess you could argue, hones that in the courtroom. I mean, how many juries does he get in front of? How many judges does he get in front of? He has this. We talk now about talking to real Americans. How many human beings had he had to make arguments to? That's his. He's a super communicator because he spent his adult life communicating with regular people all across the West.
What they said about him was the reason he was so successful. He was really one of the most successful lawyers. We forget that in his area. Was because he made the juries feel they were coming to the conclusion he wanted them to come to. He made them understand the facts. He made them understand the arguments. So it was natural. They said, of course this guy is guilty, or of course this guy is innocent. And he was a great lawyer in that way. I think that's right. I mean, and that's what he was feeling about the American people. He famously said, with public sentiment, anything is possible. Without it, nothing is possible. He knew that in a democracy, that's the most important thing you have to do. That's why you're picking up on communication as a skill. Unless the people are with you, I mean, there can be agitators on the outside pushing you in. They have to realize that was the great thing between Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. They became these really interesting partners, sort of, where Douglass was always arguing for him to go further than he was willing to go at the time. And finally, at the end, Douglass realized that if you judged Lincoln by abolitionist standards, he was slow and tardy and dull. But if you judged him by the standards of a president who has to worry about the sentiments of all the people, he was forward and active and radical. And then that's the really interesting thing about a democracy.
And not to get away from Lincoln, but I found that to be one of the most fascinating themes of the bully pulpit was Roosevelt's ability, I guess also Franklin Roosevelt too, their ability to communicate effectively with the public and to understand the media environment and how to get, when they are ahead of where the public is, how to bring the public along with them to persuade, not like a demagogue, but to persuade and effectively call out the best in people is just a very unique skill.
Right, and it's probably the most important quality in a democracy that a leader has, and that's why establishing trust in your word, and allowing people to believe that you're saying something that you can be trusted in. When you lose that trust, then democracy is in peril.
Yeah, and then they, each one of them was in their own way on top of whatever the technology of their time was. Lincoln with newspapers, and Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, obviously with the next round of newspapers, and then radio with Franklin. Roosevelt.
Obviously Franklin Roosevelt had the perfect voice for the radio, that conversational style of voice where people felt he was talking directly to them. One of my favorite stories was about the construction worker saw his partner running home one night, and he said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Well, my president, he's coming to speak to me in my living room tonight. It's only right that I be there to greet him when he comes." But he made people feel that he would imagine in his mind he was talking to a woman working in a department store or a man on a construction line. So that he wasn't just talking abstractly, he was talking to individuals, and they felt he was talking to them. I mean, that's the magic of communication.
Well, and that's obviously also what you have to figure out as a writer is like, you are the most fascinated person in the world about this thing. You want to know every detail. And yeah, your average reader is getting in a few pages before bed, right. And you have to meet them where you have to take your enthusiasm and passion and make it infectious, but also meet them where they are.
And you've done that.
I try. Yes.
He's got millions of people who read this thing. It's so incredible.
Yeah, my publisher was not that excited when I pitched a series of books about an obscure school of ancient philosophy. But when you think about, how you actually communicate it to people in a way that they can use, that's.
So how did it start? I mean, how did the philosophy thing start? Philosophy thing, that's very articulate. How did Marcus Aurelius come into your life, and Seneca and all these characters?
Yeah, I was in college, not far from here. I went to school in Riverside, and I was introduced to the Stoics, and I think I had thought, philosophy was sort of inaccessible and complicated and theoretical, and then you read the most powerful man in the world talking to himself about why he can't huddle under the covers and stay warm.
This is so great.
Yeah, there's a passage in Meditations where Marcus Aurelius doesn't want to get up early, and he's trying to talk himself out of getting up out of bed. And the idea that that's what philosophy can be about, I think that really struck me, and just getting directly to the point and sort of saying it as well as it could be said. I think I was really struck by that.
And he talked to himself, right?
Yes, that's what Meditations translates to from the Greek. It's just to himself. So he's not. It's pretty remarkable that this book, written for private consumption, is still relevant 2,000 years
later. So does he say, "Marcus, get out of bed"?
No. But it seems like he's writing in the second person, right? Because he goes, when you get up early and you don't want to get out of bed, this is what you should say to yourself. He doesn't mean you or me. He means himself. And he might be even mortified that we're talking about it today. But because it's so specific, it becomes universal. And I do think that's what great communicators do. They manage to find something inside themselves that by talking about honestly and authentically, it creates a connection with everyone else who has either some version of that themselves or something related to that in themselves. And that's what it's about.
What about the part where these philosophers talk about the awareness of death being an important part of life?
Yeah, that is probably the theme that you see the most in the Stoics. There's a James Rahm, is a professor at Bard, has a whole edition of Seneca. It's an anthology, and it's just called How to Die, and it's just all of Seneca's thoughts on death. And that's because obviously death was more commonplace in the ancient world, and then, just as it is today, still inevitable. And so the Stoic practice of memento mori is the kind of active meditation on the fragility and ephemerality of life. And the idea was that in meditating on that, it gives you not something depressing or melancholy, but something sort of urgent and clarifying that reminds you, like, you have right now, what are you going to do with it? And that's the sort of Stoic practice.
Yeah, I think time becomes, time is the most precious resource we have, right? Mm-hmm. And for me now, just being 83, I feel an awareness. I don't feel an awareness of death, but I certainly feel an awareness that I've not got 30 years left. And so I have to decide how I'm going to spend the days, which I'm not sure you think about when you're younger. And again, I know that's one of the Stoics' thoughts, what's essential and what's not essential.
Yes.
But I think I'm closer to feeling what's essential. I know that I only want to work with people that I care about. that I don't have time for assholes, even if it's somehow a project that might be interesting. And I've been able to go into other fields now because the process of writing is so lonely. And I was able to do it when my husband was there every day because we could share things at the end of the day. But with my partner, Beth Lasky, we formed a production company, gotten involved in documentaries and movies, and that's collaborative. And I realized I need that collaboration. I realized I need the idea of being able to see friends that every single Tuesday night there's a group of 6 women that I get together with at this club in Boston that used to be an old stuffy men's club, and now it's become this young, hot club. I thought I'd meet a guy there when I got there. The average age is now 40 because it's so popular. Anyway, it's been wonderful, and every Tuesday night, these 6 women get together, and we know each other, and we talk about ourselves, but we also talk about the country and what's going on, and we now take field trips together, and it makes a huge difference to have that friendship thing. Were your guys friendly with each other?
They were. There was something called the Scipionic Circle, which was a group of Stoics that would meet right around the turn of the millennium, but they did tell us they would kick us out exactly when we hit to 0. So it's been lovely to collaborate and communicate with you tonight. Today, this is a total honor for me. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and silence all cell phones. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tina Brown with Barry Peterson.
Hello. I have a medical announcement that I must make first for all of you. You are not going blind. You are not hallucinating. This is not Brian Williams. I've been at CBS News as an on-air correspondent. My name is Barry Peterson, so I charge for autographs. I've been at CBS News for about 50 years, 25 of those overseas, living in various cities, traveling as a foreign correspondent. And I know Brian really well. I actually like Brian. He and I have been on the same stories. That means we've competed on the same stories, sometimes in the same war zone. So join me if Brian is watching. Brian, get well soon. So,
can I just say how much I love this festival? I am an old warhorse of, literary festivals, and I think Rancho Mirage is just, it rocks. Okay. Great. I'm having a wonderful time. Anyway, had to say it.
We're allowed to say that because for both of us, this is the first time we've been here. And I would say the word is fabulous.
Yeah.
It's such fun.
So fun.
Okay, so we know a lot about Tina. We know that she was a really successful magazine editor, websites, all that kind of stuff. She's great. And I want to read you I have to read it, the awards. Do we have enough time? 10 National Magazine Awards, 4 George Polk Awards. That's a big deal. They're all big deals. 5 Overseas Press Club Awards, appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the year 2000. Her name is Lady Evans.
Only when I can't get a table at a restaurant.
Okay. I wondered about that. Can I get a table? Well, it's Lady Evans. That's got to work, right?
It does.
Inducted into the Magazine Editors Hall of Fame in 2007, and she won an Emmy Award. Emmy is TV, for the documentary, producing the documentary, A Girl in the River, The Price of Forgiveness. Wow. Okay. I think when you want to understand a person, you take a look at their youth. So we're going to do that. According to Wikipedia, she was expelled from boarding school 3 times.
Unfair.
Once, referring to her headmistress' bosoms as unidentified flying objects.
You didn't tell me this was going to be an expose.
2, writing a play about the school being blown up and a public lavatory being erected in its place. And finally, organizing a demonstration to protest against the school's policy of allowing a change of underwear only 3 times a year.
That's true.
2 very important questions. How did you have the courage at that age to really just go straight at authority and to do this? And secondly, did they change the underwear policy?
Well, I was just an extremely irreverent and insubordinate sort of member of the school community always. I didn't do anything exciting, like sort of take drugs or run away with men or anything like that. I was just trouble, let's just put it that way. The great thing, though, was that I had wonderfully supportive parents. And so my father and mother got used to sort of driving up to these posh boarding schools, and my father would open up by saying, how terrible for you to have failed with this brilliant child. I mean, how do you feel about your failure? And they were sort of very taken aback, and then we all got on our high horses and we drove off with my trunk packed in the back, at which point my parents would give me hell, for being expelled again. But that was nice to always feel that my parents had my back.
Just for the record, she went to Oxford at age 16.
I did.
So when she took over Vanity Fair in the mid-1980s, it had 200,000 subscribers. 8 years later, 1.2 million. She did the same thing when she took over The New Yorker. So what I want to know is, when you walked into these magazines, both of them in trouble, when you walked in, what was your vision of how you were going to turn this around?
Well, with Vanity Fair, I really did have a vision. I mean, I was an addict of old magazines. You know, I had collected the great magazines of the 30s, which, you know, Vanity Fair in its heyday with writers like, you know, Claire Booth Luce and photographers like Steichen and Man Ray and these great photographers. And at the same time, you know, Vanity Fair of the 30s, you know, was actually kind of 20s and 30s, was actually quite a sort of lightweight magazine. And in the period since, we'd had great magazines like Rolling Stone and Clay Felker's great New York magazine. And I saw Vanity Fair as a kind of bringing together the visual seduction, if you like, of the great magazine of the 20s and 30s, looking glamorous, being elegant, being fabulously sort of flashy, if you like.
Like her?
And yet also having the great sort of investigative writing, the great literary writing, and to put these two things together. And it took time. I mean, the major difficulty I had was just getting that mix absolutely right, because it depended on voices, great voices. I mean, I have always spent my time as an editor trying to find, locate, bring in, nurture great voices. And you know, when I got here, I didn't really know any American writers. I mean, I was a British editor. I'd edited Tatler for 4 years in London, and that was a great success. But I didn't really know. I didn't have a network, if you like. But one evening I was very, very lucky, because I was invited to dinner with a friend who I did have in New York, Marie Brenner, her name was, who I immediately hired, a great Vanity Fair writer she became. And she sat me next to this film producer who had he was sort of an out-of-work film producer. But he really had this extraordinary voice. He just told me these are great stories of Hollywood, and I thought he was really beguiling. And then at the end, we bonded, and he said that, I said, what are you doing now? He said, I'm going to Hollywood back to LA to attend the trial of my daughter's murderer. And this was Dominic Dunn. And I said to him, this is unbelievable. I said, will you keep a diary? Because one of my ruses to get sort of amateur writers is to say, keep a diary or write to me in emails and just write to me, you know, like me, you talking to me. So he said, would you read it if I wrote a diary? I said, absolutely, I'd read it. So he kept a diary of his daughter's trial, the murderer, and it was incredible. And he was a natural writer. He didn't really know how to do structure, but that's easy. You can team a writer with a great voice and a great eye with someone who can help with structure. So I teamed him with a very good editor who was at Vanity Fair. And the piece became a real classic. It was called Justice, and it was a cover story, and it was a huge impact. And then I signed him up to be our first writer. And Dominic then really became, I would say, one of the star voices of Vanity Fair. You know, he did all these great stories of high society and true crime, but with a real elegant sort of touch. And he was really critical. He and Marie Brenner, I suppose, were the two first. And then I added in, you know, Gail Sheehy, and I added in. Then I went into the more brilliant sort of literary, investigative people such as T.D. Allman and Alex Shumatoff and all of these great writers who gradually came in, while at the same time, you know, being able to nurture photographers like Annie Leibovitz and Helmut Newton and Herb Ritz, you know. So I had this amazing cadre of talent, and they all kind of began to play as an orchestra. It took about 2 years, I would say, to get that synthesis right, but it was a wonderful time.
You do not bring change to an old-fashioned organization without ruffling feathers. Somebody called you brilliant, demanding, obsessed, a shark in high heels. But this is the one that really works. Working for Tina Brown was exhausting and the most exciting job I ever had. Why?
Well, who was that?
I don't know.
Well,
I wouldn't tell you anyway, because you'd probably write about him.
No, I mean, I like being called Stalin in high heels. I thought it was rather apt. What was the question again?
Why was it so? What did you create in the atmosphere, in the office, in the magazine, that made people want to come to work because they were excited to be around you?
Well, I think, you know, I do have a great energy for stories. I mean, I am a news junkie, I'm a story junkie, and, you know, I would go out at night and I would sit next to somebody and I'd come back with a story. So I'm a bit of a golden retriever like that. I mean, I can get a story almost out of anybody, is the truth. And, you know, I had this orchestra with which to play. So there was a sense that writers could come in. First of all, I listened to their stories. And, you know, lots of editors just don't listen. So sometimes a writer starts to talk and you ask them to come in because you want to do a profile of Barry Peterson, you know, and you then see you talk about something else and their eyes light up and you realize they should be doing that story, not this story. And so they liked that about me, that I would resonate with what they were interested in. I also do remember what people are interested in. So, you know, I'll meet a writer and they'll say that, you know, they're really fascinated with the archaeology or something, and, you know, I don't see them for a year and a half. And then there's an amazing story about, you know, the finding of some tomb in Egypt or something, and I'll think that writer would be the one. So they liked the fact that I could match them with the stories. And I also sort of just think that we then, you know, my love of this group meant that I spent a lot of time promoting them too. I mean, I really think the editor's job is to be something of an impresario and to really make their team into stars, you know. So I was able to do that for them, and that made them feel great because they were part of this kind of star A-team. And we really became a kind of a wonderful group, all working towards the same goals. And you know, closing an issue became such a kind of fabulous sort of tumult. And we'd often go off on sort of school outings, like we'd all go to LA for the Oscars, and I would take, you know, all of this group to the Oscars, and we'd have a ball, and we would be irreverent, and we were all great friends. I had a wonderful LA bureau chief in Caroline Graham, who was sitting here in the audience and came with me to 3 magazines, and she sort of brought the world of Hollywood to Vanity Fair. So we just had enormous fun, and the office of Vanity Fair was just HQ action. You know, it was, when people say they don't want to go to the office, I think, what is your problem? I mean, you know, the Vanity Fair offices.
We should go back to the shark thing.
I mean, the New Yorker, you know, the New Yorker offices were just absolutely wonderful. I mean, I could sit there having a sandwich with John Updike, and I mean, who wouldn't want to do that, you know? And the office was just teeming with like David Remnick and Art Spiegelman and Adam Gopnik, all these wonderful writers, and they liked each other. They loved the work they were doing. It was all about the passion for the work, you know, and I just feel somehow that a lot of that's gone in our world, you know. I mean, just the passion for the work. Instead of always wondering, how am I going to get funding? Is anybody going to read it? You know, I mean, the amount of clickbait and all that stuff, it wasn't that. It was about, how can I do a brilliant piece, the best piece I can do, choosing the great pictures, writing the great headlines. And you know, that was a very, very creative and fulfilling thing for all of us.
The beginning of my career was 78 into the 80s and 90s, and my God, weren't they fun.
Oh, so much fun. I mean, I'm saddened for younger people now who can't have that fun, you know, because it's all been detonated, alas, by digital disruption and corporate greed and all the other many culprits of our era.
As an editor at Vanity Fair for 8 years, you looked at a lot of articles. I want to know the article you looked at, didn't publish, and said later, damn, I should have done that.
Well, there was one rather terrible omission. James Fenton sent in his piece about the fall of Saigon, and it was late, and I already had a piece about the fall of Saigon by Pete Hamill, and so I told him that I wouldn't publish it. He still talks about it 45 years later, by the way, because it's been sort of anthologized in every book. And sometimes, actually, Vanity Fair at the beginning, I knew so little about America that sometimes I didn't know that some huge sacred cow of American culture had sent me in a piece, and I just thought, not great. You know, I was right, but still, I mean, when somebody like, you know, Balanchine's, what was his, the great Lincoln Kirstein sent me a big piece about, like, working with Balanchine, I mean, it mortifies me that I kind of thought, this is just so boring, you know. I should have been a little more careful. So there have been times when I've done that, but most of the time I will say I do identify a great piece when it comes in and find a way to get it in.
When you took over the New Yorker, I had this mental vision of you going to the office of this fusty magazine with a broom trying to make your way through the cobwebs. After you took over, what article was in that magazine I never would have read if you hadn't been there?
Probably Paul Theroux's description of a profile of a dominatrix, which was a wonderful piece. But, you know, my feeling was, you know, I tell you, there was a really, really great piece that was very controversial, but the whole point was it had to be done by a great literary writer. And this was a piece by Daphne Merkin, who's a really first-class critic who, you know, wrote for the New York Review of Books. and she wrote a piece about her desire to be spanked. Okay.
Well, that's New Yorker material if I ever heard anything.
But it was an amazing piece of writing. And the only thing I regret is that I never said to her, well, you might want to think about how it's going to be at your next parent-teacher meeting. I was quite good at sort of persuading people that, no one's going to think of anything except this is just great sentences. Well, I mean, she's still sort of hiding from the stalkers, you know. But it was a wonderful piece.
You ran it?
I ran it. Are you kidding me?
How did the New Yorker audience react to that?
They loved it. I mean, circulation, you know, went up by like 40% when I was there. The whole point was it was a really well-written piece. I mean, you know, you couldn't do a piece like that unless it was also a literary piece that then went into all sorts of anthologies afterwards. I mean, you can't just do some cheesy piece, you know, about that. So I wouldn't have published it if it hadn't been really good, but it was.
I want to ask you about the British Royals. Do you know anything about those?
Yes.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but because your books are so wonderful that you don't need to spend time talking about it, you need to read them. They're fabulous.
Thank you.
So you did call them a crumbling theme park.
Oh, did I? Oh,
the
dear.
creek of irrelevance and decay. Mm-hmm. So I only have one question, please. Help me understand. Harry and Meghan get married, yada, yada, yada. They go to Australia, they go to Fiji, they go to Tonga, they go to New Zealand. People love her because they go to places of people who look like her. Mm-hmm. And when you watch that, you say, what an extraordinary opportunity for this family to reach into the Commonwealth with someone who can touch those people. And instead they dumped her. Wasn't there an adult in the room?
Well, it was all really tragic because actually the Queen, in fairness to her, saw that. I mean, she thought that they were all very excited at the idea that they would have, you know, a beautiful young woman of color in the royal family because, you know, talk about a white outfit, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, and England is not. I mean, they needed it very badly, actually, to have someone like Meghan in the family. They were all very excited about it. The Queen, you know, gave her the job of being the Commonwealth sort of representative with Harry, and they blew it, unfortunately. And I'm sure that Harry must so regret that now, really, because nothing would have been better for them than to have been the ambassadors for the Commonwealth. And by the way, the Commonwealth itself is kind of a sleeping beauty, particularly since Brexit. There is a real role, finally, for the Commonwealth to be sort of regenerated and rebranded. But they haven't got anyone to do that, and now it just remains this fusty-dusty thing, the Commonwealth. And I think that actually William has absolutely zero interest in the Commonwealth. So it was actually a real tragic thing. But unfortunately, you know, it was a combination of, I would say, the Windsors' lack of real imagination and Harry and Meghan's real foolhardy sort of stubbornness and you know, immaturity about what this role could be. And there was a lot of it was a lot of mess on both sides, really. I mean, what Harry wanted, what they wanted was to be this half in, half out. They wanted to be royal sort of half the year and able to then go off and make big money and leverage what they were doing. Well, you cannot be a royal and leverage the crown for commercial gain. You just simply can't. I mean, even if they'd said yes to it, can you imagine what the press would do to them? You know, saying they're selling out the crown, they're capitalizing on the crown. So the only way they could do other stuff was if it wasn't paid, essentially. And they would be fine. I mean, the Queen would have been fine with, all of them would have been fine with them having other activities. They couldn't be paid for them. And this is the perennial undercurrent of mischief, as it were, in the current modern royal family, which is they're broke half the time. You know, they need the money, but they can't do anything to earn any money. So this is the tension, and this is why you get the disasters of things like Prince Andrew and other members of the royal family too, who, you know, are less well famous here. I mean, Prince Michael of, you know, Kent was caught by sort of a journalist posing as a Russian oligarch offering him some major deal. I mean, you know, they're always looking, they're always scrabbling around for money, and it's except for the heir, who is enormously well off. I mean, William, the Duchy of Cornwall is a massively lucrative enterprise, and now that the king is the king. The Duchy of Cornwall now is the Prince of Wales, always goes to the Prince of Wales. So, for instance, William is now enormously rich. And the second son in the horrible tradition of primogeniture in the upper classes, where the first child son gets everything, and the second son used to have to go into the church and sort of be some kind of hanger-on. That's also true, in the royal family. So it's just not a good scene to have one person in the family with everything, and the other one sort of like feeling spare, as Harry wrote. And Harry's a hothead. I happen to like Harry a lot. I mean, I think that
He's a lot more fun than William.
Yeah, he is. I mean, and that's part of the problem. Harry
drinks, he goes to bars,
yeah,
he kisses women, it's like fabulous.
Actually, Harry's really good at being a prince.
Yeah.
It's really the only thing he can do, and he's great at it. But alas, is not allowed to be it anymore, which I find a great tragedy, actually, for the family.
I lied. I have one more question about the royals. I want to know, this is very disrespectful, I apologize. William and Kate, did they specifically choose her because she's so boring?
Ooh.
I lived there. I covered I was there when Princess Diana was there.
Well, she wasn't boring.
There was a wonderful line. Let me stop for a second. I've done thousands and thousands of interviews, and when I was there, we did a story on Princess Di. They were still together, sitting in Hyde Park, and I was talking to this guy about Diana and Charles, and he said, the problem is every man in Great Britain is in love with Diana except the man she wants to love her.
I know. Well, this was the great tragedy of Diana. It really, really was a tragedy that, people erroneously think, and Meghan erroneously thinks, that Diana would have loved to be out of the royal family, and if she'd had her way, she would have lived in America. No, she didn't want to be out of the royal family. Her husband wasn't in love with her. That was the problem. It was her marriage that was the problem.
Right.
She actually never actually left. She was very canny. She never left Kensington Palace. She wanted to stay in Kensington Palace. She knew that the charisma of royalty was way more effective in her philanthropies than just being a celebrity. If she hadn't been royal, the impact of her shaking hands with an AIDS patient at Middlesex Hospital without gloves, which was the main thing at the time, without gloves, and embracing an AIDS victim, it was the gesture that, was seminal around the world. Had she just simply been a famous woman doing that, it would have been a nice photo shoot, but it wouldn't have had the potency that it did as a member of the royal family, and Diana always understood that. So she didn't want to leave the royal family at all. She wanted to stay married to Charles, but, she couldn't do it because he wasn't in love with her. And I had lunch with Diana 6 weeks before she died in New York. She was in New York for the auction of all of her dresses for charity at Christie's, and she invited me to lunch with Anna Wintour to sort of talk about her life at the moment, etc. And it was such a fascinating occasion. Of course, 6 weeks later when she died in the Alma Tunnel, I couldn't believe it, because she was, for a start, I have never, ever met anybody more beautiful and charismatic than she was. I had met her, many times in her younger years. But in the intervening years, she walks into the Four Seasons restaurant. She's nearly 6 feet tall because of, she's 5'11" and she's in these heels and this Saint Laurent suit. And she just, the ravishing beauty, and the eyes were just like huge, limpid, pools of suffused with, feeling. And she was just this gorgeous person. And she was breathtaking, really. And then she starts to talk about how lonely she is. She talks about how she dreads the summer because this was in June, and she said, I dread August because the boys go to Balmoral. And she said, I'm on my own. And I said, well, surely everybody wants you to stay, to come and stay. And she said, well, no, because when I come and stay, their whole lives are disrupted by the press. Their garbage is gone through. They're tormented by photographers. So she said, I really have a really difficult time of being on vacation, which, by the way, made me realize why she was on that boat, of course, with Fayed, because she thought, tragically, wrongly, that she would be protected, that on this boat, there was all of this, a boat, a plane, and all the things that she sort of needed to be protected, which is, of course, the great miscalculation of her tragic life. But, you know, she was so extraordinarily special, but her sense of being a princess was very core, you know, to her. And she actually said at that lunch, you know, she talked about her regret, even though it was post-divorce. She said how much she still regretted not being married to Charles. And she said, you know, we would have been such a great team. And it was almost as if at 36 she had finally kind of come out, but she was so young, don't forget. I mean, she was 19 when she met Charles. I mean, she knew him, she had met him 13 times before she married him. And I mean, now, all of us think now, I mean, now I have a daughter and things, I think, my God, I mean, if my daughter at 20 had married this person she'd met 3 times and who was part of this massive carapace of the royal family, you know, and all of that pressure, not only of monarchy, but of, you know, the paparazzi and all the rest of it, no wonder, you know, things went so awry. But by the time she was 36, I think if Charles had met her when she was 36, I actually think the marriage could have been perfectly okay. I mean, he would have always wanted to have a mistress with Camilla, but...
I'm sorry? What
did
you just say?
He would have always wanted to have a mistress. I mean, you know, Camilla...
And did he not say at some point, why doesn't she understand that?
Well, he said that because all of his circle behaved the same way. Mm-hmm. And many of her circle did. And if she was 36, she might have thought, you know what, there's some compensations, I can have a private life, you know. But when you're young, she was romantic. She was in love with her husband.
I know you have met people. I know you have met people. And when I was around Princess Diana, she was one of those people that when she walked into the room, no matter where you were, you turned. Mm-hmm. She had some sort of magic about her that captured the audience, which brings us back to Kate. Sorry, I withdraw boring, incredibly unexciting.
Very popular, though. I mean, people, look, I mean, she has absorbed the lesson that she simply cannot make any trouble because, you know, after Diana, frankly, the royal family had total PTSD. I mean, they had this kind of like Elvis Presley. I mean, it was like a nightmare for them. They were totally upstaged. As we know, Charles was traumatized by her charisma because, you know, nobody wanted to see him ever. I mean, the worst thing that happened to their marriage was the first trip they made to Wales as Prince and Princess of Wales.
I wouldn't mind being Charles, but I'm not doing the ears.
Yeah, no, well, I understand. But, you know, Charles would walk down one side and she'd walk down the other in a walkabout, and the people who got Charles went, ugh. I mean, that's not great for a marriage, okay? So the Queen always used to say, well, as long as they're not another Diana, we don't want another Diana. We certainly don't want another Diana. And, you know, William had been sort of raised to understand that, you know, who he married, which is true of all of them, is the most important decision he was going to make. So he took 10 years to propose to her, right? And there aren't that many modern young women who've been to university and, you know, and are sort of accomplished and modern, whatever, who are going to kind of wait around for 10 years. I mean, she was known as Waity Katie, and, you know, she hated that mantra, but she really didn't have a proper job. I mean, she literally was waiting for William to propose, and she did sort of learn and imbibe this thing of being perfect. And so that's what she is. And, you know, I mean, there aren't any scandals around her. What do we want from her? You know, I mean, we want her to be more interesting, but in today's world of social media, being, quote, interesting is pretty hazardous.
I have the feeling that she's specifically careful to never outshine William, like
She's
Diana.
Very careful. But actually, her leverage is increasing. And she knows it too. I mean, Kate has a lot of power now. And people are realizing that she sort of is the power in the royal family at this point. Because if anything goes wrong with that marriage, end. You know, it will be disastrous at this point.
I want to segue to something more current, Jeffrey Epstein. You met Jeffrey Epstein. You founded the Daily Beast. You did a series of articles about his sweet deal in Florida where he was charged to deal with sexual issues. He made a private deal with the feds that they would ignore what he did if he would plead guilty to 18 months for local charges in Florida, and then he's got free. And then you wrote about it, and I think that's how you met him. Tell us.
Right, well, that story was actually brought to me by a woman called Conchita Sarnoff, who actually wasn't a writer, she was a anti-trafficking campaigner, and she brought the story to me because I produced this summit every year called Women in the World, which was about sort of a wonderful convening of empowered women and from all over the place. And she thought I'd done quite a lot of exposure of that topic on those panels. So she came to me with the story and she said, I want to do this story about this guy, Jeffrey Epstein, who is a sexual trafficker, but he's got off, and she told me the story that you just told me. And it turned out that the way she got the story was that she was interviewing a Mexican sex trafficker in the Palm Beach stockade for her sex trafficking campaign work. And he said to her, most of the girls I bring in, these 14-year-olds, are really for rich people in Palm Beach. They're men who are here, businessmen. And she was very taken aback to hear that. And then it clicked with her that she'd seen a tiny item in the Palm Beach paper which said that Jeffrey Epstein had been charged. And as it happened, she sort of knew Jeffrey Epstein because Conchita was a sort of social woman in New York, so the name rang a bell. So she said she went off and she got pictures of Jeffrey Epstein, and she brought them back to the Mexican sex trafficker. And she said, "Is this one of your customers?" And he said, "Yeah, it is actually. Who is that guy?" And she said, "He's this guy, Jeffrey Epstein." So she thought, right. And she went to the police files. She got in there. She was very enterprising. She read all the files and she thought, my God, there are all these women. There are so many women. Why is this like just one person been charged? I mean, there were so many affidavits from all of these young girls of 14 and 15. And she thought it was an extraordinary scandal that he had got so little. So she brought that to me. And we published 6 stories actually about that, one after the other. So just before the first one came out, I had met Jeffrey Epstein briefly at the Clinton Global Initiative, where he had been on the opening night. He was just a kind of one of those guys who sort of, eyes rake the room looking for somebody more important to talk to. And he was like, he was just a sort of a guy about town who was not particularly interesting to me. But anyway, I hadn't met him. And so he calls me at the Daily Beast and he says, you have this nutcase called, Conchita Sarnoff, like on my case. And, this is all rubbish. It's nonsense. It's totally outrageous. You're going to hear from my lawyers. You're not publishing that story. She is totally out of control. And I said, well, look, talk to our lawyers if you want, but we've done a lot of reporting here, and I think it's a good story, and we're going to run it. So I expected then a blizzard of writs. Nothing happened. We published the story. And then I was in the art department at the Daily Beast, and I came back to my office, which was a sort of glass box in Barry Diller. Barry Diller was my backer at the Daily Beast, and it was in his building, IAC's building. I came back to my office one day, and sitting in my office was Jeffrey Epstein, in my office, in a chair. And I stopped at the door. It was like a New Yorker cartoon. I was like standing at the door, staring at this guy with the silver hair who I'd met at the CGI. I have no idea to this day how he got past reception. How did I not get a call saying Jeffrey Epstein's in the lobby? Because it was quite a sort of difficult reception. Part of his, con man's whatever, but he got up to my office, found where I was, came into my office, and he sat down. And I said, what are you doing here, Jeffrey? He said, looked at me and he said, just stop. Mm-hmm. And I said, Jeffrey, I'm not going to stop. We've actually got another piece coming in a few days. And I've said to you, if you have an issue, you should call our lawyer. Just stop. And he looked at me with these kind of like cold, it was a very chilling exchange. And I said, look, I didn't invite you up here, so I think you should leave. I'll give you the name of our lawyer again, and you take it up with him, Jeffrey. Leaves. Don't hear any more. He'd made the computation that this was the Daily Beast. It wasn't going to have necessarily the traction of something like the New York Times. And at that time, you see, this was pre-Me Too. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't a big name, really, at all. He was just this social guy who people weren't that interested in. So we ran our stories. They didn't land in any of the same way that, for instance, the Julie Brown series and the Miami Herald eventually did, because she wrote post-Me Too. That's the reason. And because Acosta, who had been the prosecutor, had then been given a job in the Trump cabinet. So suddenly there was interest in Acosta. That made her interested in him as a prosecutor. That brought the Epstein case, up again. But Conchita has continued on the story. She was the one who broke all of it, actually. She broke she had the plane logs. So we did get some interest about the fact that Bill Clinton was on the plane. What was he doing on the plane? So she had the phone logs. She had all the interviews with Virginia Giuffre. She had interviews with a dozen other girls. She had videos. I mean, it was an amazing series, and she was, she really was the first person to break the story. So I'm very proud of that fact. But there was just an addendum to that. So about 3 months later, I get a call from the film publicist Peggy Siegel, and she gives parties and screenings, in Manhattan. And she goes, Tina, I've got the most wonderful, I want you to come to a wonderful dinner party tonight. It's a wonderful dinner party for Prince Andrew, who's in town. And I said, really? I said, like, who's the host? She said, it's a great dinner party. It's going to be Jeffrey Epstein and Charlie Rose and...
Ouch.
Yeah, and she said, and it's at Jeffrey Epstein's house, and we'd love you to come. And I said, Peggy, what the hell is this, the pedophile's ball? I said, and I shouted this across the office, and Lloyd Grovey, who was sitting next to me, the journalist, he said to me to this day, he can remember me going, what the fuck is this, like the pedophile's ball? I was so outraged. I said to her, didn't you read, the fact that we've done this piece, we've done 6 pieces about this guy, he's a pedophile, he's a nightmare. Well, I have no desire to go and have dinner at his house with him or with anybody. And as for Prince Andrew, anyway, I ranted on and didn't go. And I'm so happy because it now has become a sort of famous night of shame. Like, were you at this dinner? Katie Couric was sort of lured into going, and so was George Stephanopoulos. Part of me wishes I had gone, I have to be honest, because it would have been another great scene. But it just shows that, she said, oh, no, she said the Jeffrey Epstein, all that was just nonsense, it was just nonsense, it was overblown, it was just this girl who was sort of a hooker, and, she just totally, and I was so outraged. But it also shows, the enabling and the kind of promotion of Jeffrey Epstein, it went on so long, and that's, of course, what we're seeing now with all the unreleased files, that it doesn't go away.
Just out of curiosity, when somebody points a finger at you and says, just stop, how the hell is that even going to work? I mean, you tell Tina Brown to just stop, she's going to go faster and harder.
I mean, it was an intimidating moment, and I would say
frightening.
Yeah, it was.
He's in your space.
Well, I mean, it was frightening, actually, because it was just so creepy the way he got into my room. I had never had that experience before. But of course, it made me realize what a creepy guy he was, too. It actually made me so happy we were doing it, because he was clearly such a bad dude, is the truth. And I mean, I knew Ghislaine Maxwell quite well, too, because she was sort of on the circuit, and, it's still, the truth is still not out. I mean, they're right to want those files to come out, because there is a lot of layers to the story that, have never really been penetrated.
2 questions. Do you know more about that than you've been able to say about the files? And secondly, will we ever see them?
I mean, the problem is, you see, by releasing thousands of documents, truth to tell, in some ways, it's like everything Trump does. It'll overwhelm us, because it's not ever been prosecuted actually as a proper trial. What you wanted was a proper trial where you really were able to have these documents marshaled to the point that you knew what you're on about. Leaks here and there of this person, that person. Clearly, Trump has, is holding on to a lot of stuff that is both self-incriminating and incriminating of his friends. Whether we'll ever get to it, I don't know. There is so much power and money attached to the people in these files that, they always manage to squash it, in some way. And I think they're now hoping again that, I'm sure that next time it comes up, we'll like bomb Iran again, I mean, ultimately, there's a lot of distraction going on, so we don't see them.
We're going to now move to the Tina Brown bonus round. There's no money involved, just for the record. This is Tina Brown on things you have said. I don't understand this. I really don't. Powerful women always interpret hostility as unrequited love. What?
Interesting I said that. Maybe I'm just talking about myself.
It was printed.
Well, maybe I'm just talking about it myself. I don't know. It's a good line, I have to be honest. I'll stand by it.
Sorry?
I will stand by it.
But what does it mean? I mean, you have been a woman who's worked in a man's world for so long. How did that occur to you?
Well, I mean, just because, I mean, I think some men are very insecure, and, you know, their way of making their number is to be angry, you know. I've had a bit of that in my time, but I've also had a lot of patronizing behavior from men that, you know, that I didn't even really interpret it as that when I was in it. And it's only since I've sort of had distance on my career that I realized how often I was sort of dealing with the, what's the word, you know, the kind of patronizing. For instance, like when I won awards, you mentioned the awards that I'd won, but so often the citations were somehow demeaning. You know, they were like, you'd find that the men were called like, his brave and courageous journalism has blah, blah, blah. With me, it was like, she's buzzy, she's irreverent. I mean, I sounded like a rockette or something. And it just got on my nerves after a while. You know, that I'd published some 20,000 word piece about a massacre in El Salvador, and I'm being called buzzy and irreverent and, you know, and saucy and, you know, and that is a kind of subliminal put down, actually. Mm-hmm. So I got kind of really aggravated by that over the years. And also, you know, I found that when I was at Condé Nast particularly, although I'd very much loved the owner of Condé Nast, Cy Newhouse, and I owe my whole career to him. I did Tatler, Vanity Fair, and the New Yorker for him. He just never paid any attention to anything I had to say about the actual sort of business of the magazine. It was like, don't worry your pretty head about the business side, you know. And finally, I mean, I left the New Yorker mainly because I had the perception that the New Yorker should be more than a magazine. I thought it should be a book company, a TV company, you know, I thought that the New Yorker should be like, as I put it at the time in my memo, like the HBO of print, and that we should have these extensions and live events and festivals and all the things that I thought the New Yorker could be the core, and then we would have this stuff. So I go and I talk to Cy Newhouse about it, and he had this maddening habit of starting to nod his head like this before you'd even finished speaking. So, which is why I put everything in writing, because he'd have to read it to the end. But I went to see him and I had to have this out because, you know, I knew we would never make enough money with just advertising. I knew we had to have these extensions. And he said, stick to your knitting. No. Stick to your knitting, he said. And that's when I just thought, okay, I'm done, you know.
Would you have had that reaction now when you could have said, screw you or something like that? Or?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I would have said, I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, you know, really. And I was right, P.S., because it took them like another 10 years to do everything I said, which is why the New Yorker is now a profitable magazine, because they have a book company thing now, they have the literary festival, everything I said, they did, eventually. But David Remnick had frustrations, but in the end, you know, could get through, and I honestly believe that it was because I was a woman who wasn't sticking to her knitting, you know, that he was sort of treating me that way, actually.
I need a personal moment. When I was reading what you wrote, I'm like, dear God, I hope I'm never a profile that you would write about. And then I was on Fresh Hell, which is your website.
My Substack.
Substack. And you wrote about your son, who has autism and Asperger's, as does my granddaughter. And I thought it was an amazing story. It was about getting George's 40th birthday done in the middle of a snowstorm. What you did, how you arranged, how you reshuffled cars and all of that. And he absolutely loved it. And you wrote so wonderfully about this, that there was a part of this that really hit me that I would like you to read to the rest of us about being the mother of a child with autism. Please.
Georgie is also blessed with uniquely wonderful qualities that cancel out the rest. His perennially upbeat energy, his guileless social brio, his disinhibited displays of affection, his unfiltered inability to say anything untrue or be anything but himself. It's true. It really is. He has no filter at all, Georgie, absolutely none. And he's so funny. He is hilarious. We once went out to a dinner, you know, and he came with us and so on. And at the end of it, the host said to him, well, I hope you had a good time, Georgie. He said, not really. It was really very boring. He said nobody really spoke to me, and
We're done. We have to stop.
The food was okay.
Tom Brady of journalism, the greatest of all time. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and silence all cell phones. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and silence all cell phones. The program is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the founder of the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival, Jamie Kapler.
Thank you. Thank you, friends. Well, as we come to the close of the 2026 festival, what a note to go out on. And I'm so proud that, I know some of you all, we've missed a lot of sessions. I've been in this room the whole time. But remember, thank you, Sherry Allen. Thank you, Catherine Reed. All of them programs are being filmed. We'll all see them in a week or two. But it is my great honor to close this festival with, I think, one of the great interviewers and writers is Doris Kerns Goodwin and Melinda French Gates. Please welcome them.
We need you to come everywhere.
Definitely.
Oh, how glad I am to be here and to be with Melinda French Gates.
Likewise.
Just think about her. She's a philanthropist. She's an advocate. She's an author of this wonderful new book, The Next Day, which is she writes about life's transitions. It's something we all go through every day of our lives. Well, maybe not every day of our lives, but the idea of becoming a parent, the death of a close friend, the end of her 27-year marriage, turning 60, which is young for me at 83, but she thought about that as a big transition, stepping away from the Gates Foundation. The book is so moving, and I think it's instructive for any of us who are navigating change. It's got intimate, personal stories. She reflects, I think, with grace and courage. I really love the book. So much wisdom packed along the way. So I can't wait to begin. This is my first time meeting you, and I'm really very glad to do so.
And I'm a huge fan of your work, too.
So this is perfect.
Yeah, I mean, who wouldn't be, right?
Okay. So you said that The Next Day was inspired by your 2024 commencement at Stanford University. And those addresses are never easy. I hate giving them. I mean, it's really hard. There's cliches, and the kids don't really want to be there, blah, blah, blah. But you said, you captured it perfectly. You said the next day is when the real work begins. Because what we do the next day is what makes us who we are. So let's see how you came up with this. Was there a specific next day that inspired you to take that approach for the commencement?
Well, first of all, I talked to the senior class presidents at Stanford a couple of times to try and understand, what would actually be meaningful for them. I mean, this is their event, right? And all of them talked about kind of being on this path in life that, they'd gotten to Stanford, they were supposed to study this, they're supposed to go to that career. And they said, could you talk to us a little bit about transitions? And I thought, wow, okay, at age 60, by then, you've been through a lot of transitions in life, some you wanted to go through and you did yourself, some unexpectedly, and I thought, yeah, I have some things to say about that. So I did the speech, and then, as my mom says, as we get older, we get more so. I was like, I have even more to say about that, so I wrote a book.
That's excellent. So let's go back to your childhood, because I think some of the really interesting transitions happened there. You said your mother stayed home to care for you and your siblings and run your household. You always knew you wanted to be a mother, but you also wanted to be like your father. And your father went to work every day, and there were few examples of growing up with women with careers. The same was true for me. I grew up on my block. The only woman who worked was an unmarried teacher. And so I had no examples of people working and having a family, except there was a delicatessen on the corner, and they ran the delicatessen together, the wife and the husband, and they lived above it. So I thought, this is ideal. I want to run a delicatessen, and I can cut salami and pastrami with my husband, and my kids will be above me. It'll work. So for you open the story with I think the book with such a great story about what happened when you were wearing nail polish at your Catholic school. Tell them about that, because it's so emblematic of this whole idea.
So I grew up in a family, we're Catholic, and I went K through 12 to Catholic school. The K through 8 school was a parochial school, and it was attached to a church. So there was a principal and nun who ran the school, but the priests ran the church and were also somewhat in charge of the school. So anyway, they had all these rules, as schools do, but there were some specific rules for girls about the length of our skirts, and the other one was about not wearing nail polish. And I'm a pretty obedient, or I was at the time, kid. But you know, we dressed up to go to church. I lived in Texas, Dallas, Texas, down in the South. And so I had put some nail polish on, which was fine to go to church, and not realizing on Monday morning it was clear, I showed up to school with it on. Well, wouldn't you know, the priest decided that day they would go through all the classrooms and have all the girls put their hands on the desks and see who had nail polish. And I literally thought, well, I'm not going to be in trouble. I have like clear on. What's the big deal? No. I got tapped on the shoulder, sent down to the principal's office. Well, the interesting part of the story was that, so the principal decided we each had to use the phone. Instead of giving us a pink slip and sending us, you know, telling our parents what we did or whatever, they said, call your mom, everybody that had nail polish on, and she has to bring nail polish remover. So my mother also was running our family business at home. My dad was an engineer, would go off during the day, but we had a family business of a property business. So she was running that, and I had two much younger brothers at home. So my mom hauls the boys, gets one up for a nap, hauls them to school. I get the nail polish off, I go back to my classroom. So that night, when my father comes home from his engineering job, my mom immediately, you know, tells him what happened. I was not in trouble at all. And in fact, quite the opposite. My dad was incensed, absolutely incensed that one, the priest would come around the school and have such a, you know, a rule for girls, but okay, there's a rule. But two, that it took my mom's time, that the school said to my mom she had nothing better to do than to bring nail polish remover. Because there were a lot of other ways that situation could have been handled. But for me as a young girl, what it taught me was, first of all, some rules are man-made, even in a religion, actually. And number two, yeah, that my dad thought a lot about my mom's time. Right? He valued what she did. And it just spoke volumes to me as a young girl.
Oh, what matters. That's great.
Yeah.
Yay for your father and your mother.
And my parents are still very healthy and alive. My dad just turned 87. My mom's 85, and I'm going after this to see them in San Diego for the weekend.
They must be so proud of you. I'm so glad.
They're a big, huge inspiration to me.
So then you go to Microsoft. You're the only woman in that hiring class. And you talk about in your previous book that it was a high testosterone, argumentative environment. How did you navigate that?
Yeah, I would kind of describe it as the boys' debate club. And again, I had gone K through 8 to Catholic school co-ed. I went high school, all girls Catholic, and then I went to Duke University. And I was a computer science major at Duke. So I was used to, in computer science, there just weren't very many young men. And I was already used to running teams, actually, of men working on projects. I would always sort of end up in those roles. But what I wasn't used to, I loved the intellectual curiosity. I loved the drive. I was competitive. But what I didn't like was this sort of debate for debate's sake. And so I thought at some point, kind of 2 years into the company, that I might just leave. Because what was happening was I could play the game, I saw the game, I knew the game, but I didn't like myself. Like I would leave work and I would go, you know, let's say to the grocery store, and I was just not a very nice person. And I thought, this isn't who I want to be. I'm changing. And so I thought I was going to quit. I had had some other job offers. I knew I could get another job. But I thought, well, before I quit, I will try just being myself. And I literally thought I was going to fall flat on my face. And I thought, well, if I do, okay, I'll go get another job. And wouldn't you know, the more I was myself, the more I was in a high management position by then, I could attract more and more people to my teams, men and women, but a lot of men. And people would say to me, how did you get that hardcore developer from that other part of the company? And I would say, well, I guess he wanted to work in a different culture. And so I really started to think a lot about culture. I learned about it in business school, and I didn't think it really mattered. And it made me realize how much culture matters.
Oh, there's no question. I mean, when I studied the leaders that I've gone through, Abraham Lincoln created a culture in his team of kindness and compassion and people collaborating and wanting to do things for the larger team rather than for themselves. And that changes the people themselves, because then that's what they want to do. I think that was a great lesson to learn so when you're so young there.
I think, can I say a little bit more about that?
No, you can't. Of course you can.
So 2 things I want to say about this. So my father worked on the Apollo missions. He was an engineer literally on the first Apollo mission. And he would often come home from work and talk about how his teams were better when he could attract some of the female mathematicians to his teams. And he talked a lot about management. And I would meet these women. Actually, we'd go to the company picnic and I would meet them. And so I saw these women in business. My mom was a homemaker at first and later was working with my dad to run a property business to put us through college. But I had that notion in my head that a woman could advance in her career and that a team was better than when she was on it. But then I will say I also learned after my Microsoft experience, like when we created the foundation, I was very clear what kind of culture I wanted there. I wanted high performance, good work ethic for sure, smarts, but I wanted to make sure we had teams where we could get the best out of people, because at Microsoft I learned to build products, and I learned this in business school. When you have a team that's all working together and you pull the best out of people, the result is better, right? And it became just sort of natural to me, and so that is still how I manage.
And I bet that's what you've done now with your new organization.
With Pivotal.
You have the choice. You can make it what you want.
Totally. Totally.
Hooray. So one of the most moving parts of your book is your discussion of your friendship with a colleague who I believe came in at the same time with you at Microsoft, John Nielsen, and you hung out with him. You were together a lot. And it was a difficult experience for you when he got sick. Can you describe what felt like to deal with the grief of someone you loved so much?
Yeah. So John and I became fast friends. We were part of the first hiring class of MBAs at Microsoft. There were 9 guys and me, and I knew a lot of them quite well, but John and I became very, very good friends, and I also became very good friends with his wife. She's still, to this day, one of my best friends. But John got sick when he was John was in his early 30s when he first got sick. And that phone call to phone, and we were doing a lot together outside of work as couples, and a lot of just adventures in life. But that phone call that he was sick and he knew his cancer diagnosis was a very rare one and likely terminal, and it was really hard, and of course much harder for his wife and his family. But they allowed me to walk that journey in very, very closely. He left behind 3 young children. One of them is my goddaughter. She's getting married this August. And I learned in my early 30s, like, wow, you better think about what you want your life to be, because you don't know what day you're going to get that phone call or that diagnosis or that car accident. And you need to really think about where you want to be at the end, at least for me, and work backwards from that to say, who do I want to be today and where do I want to go? And so that was an indelible mark John left on me.
I can imagine. I mean, for me, my mother died of a heart attack when I was 15, and yet all our lives together, she had read to me. I mean, she had only an 8th grade education, but her heart condition had kept her as pretty much of an invalid in the house. But every night she would read to me, and that special sense of loving books came from her. And also storytelling, because I would constantly say to her, I wanted to remember what she was like before she had rheumatic fever as a child. That's why her heart was bad. And so once upon a time, she'd been able to skip rope or jump rope or jump up the stairs. So I would constantly say to her, Mom, tell me a story about you when you were my age. Not realizing how peculiar that was until I had my own 3 sons. Never once said to me, Mom, tell us a story about you when you were mine. But I realized that the anchor of my life, my love of reading and my love of storytelling, came from that. And then you feel like you do want to make that work, that somehow she taught me that, and I'd like to do honor for her by doing that.
And I think we carry those people inside of us, right? The people who are the most special to us, the parent who was a really good parent, or the coach or the teacher, you hold that, and it's important to look back and see, what did I learn from them and how did I make my life, organize myself around those concepts.
And it makes you know you're not just alone. You come from the past, you're passing this on to your own children. I mean, we're all part of a continuum. We live on in the memories of the people that we loved.
Absolutely. Well, you did that. Also, your book, Unfinished Love Story. Absolutely loved that book.
It was so hard. Thank you so much. I mean, it was
so beautiful.
It was so hard to decide whether to do it or not. And it took me a year and a half of thinking I can't finish this because he was doing it with me, but I'm so glad I did. And you're right, these people then live on.
They do.
You know, I mean, somehow I can imagine Dick Goodwin, wherever he is now, saying, "You talk about me every day. This is the best thing you could do." Anyway, you describe a moment that touched me because it was so relevant that women feel coming home from the hospital. You'd given birth to your first daughter, Jen, and you were fearful of what lay ahead. It was a complicated birth, and you just insisted on stopping at Starbucks on your way home. And it was easy that you didn't have to go in and get the coffee yourself, but you had to feel like that was the person that could go in, walk in, shuffle in, and come back out. And you said that now you said, yes, I'm a mother now, but I'm still myself. Describe that feeling, because I know I felt it too. I mean, I understand what you're saying.
You feel so, I'd never felt anything quite like that. You're so, this person was physically part of your body, and then you leave the hospital, in my case, 36 hours later, and like, there's this whole human being who's been in me. She's herself now. I don't really know who she's going to be, but who am I? And it was that holding on to that independence of, I can, by God, still go in and shuffle in there, even though I had stitches and everything else, into that Starbucks and order my coffee, right? It's an important feeling, I think. And I think as women, we have one of the biggest gifts in life if we choose to have children or can have children, if we're lucky enough. It's one of the most incredible gifts of life. It really is. I always knew I wanted to be a mother. And I always knew I wanted to work too. And so you have to balance, doing the right things for your kids and hopefully passing on the right values, being there at the key moments, but also how do I keep hold of who I am, right?
Yeah, I remember there was a time, I'd been a young professor at Harvard when I married my husband, and he had a child from his first marriage, and we had 2 kids immediately, 15 months apart. So suddenly I had 3 boys. And so I wasn't able to write as much as I had before. I wasn't teaching anymore. I was home, and I heard these kids at Harvard Square, I heard them say, "Whatever happened to Doris Kerns anyway? Did she die?" And I wanted to say, I have 3 boys. That's what happened to me. So I know that feeling. But
I felt like after my kids were born, when I had 3 young kids, I just felt like I was like, when am I ever going to get to read again? I was driving me crazy, right? And eventually you make room for those things.
Yeah, Eric Erickson was a professor of mine at Harvard, and he said there's a balance in life always between work, love, and play. And you have to hope that you can, each one of those spectrums, you can find work you love, play meaning something that takes you away from the seriousness of work, and love being family and friends. And at different times in your life, they're not going to be balanced. When you have kids, then the work thing is lesser. Later they can go to school and you can do more work. So you just have to be patient. But you talk about letting your perfectionism go a little bit too. So how did that work out?
Yeah, I definitely had a very strong perfectionism streak in me. And so I had this image that there was a perfect mom, like I was going to do things a certain way and make sure I was there for these events and not ever lose my temper, which of course is completely unrealistic, right? If I had had 3 boys, we might not even be sitting here. That was the one thing I knew I could not do. But it wasn't, I wish I'd learned the concept earlier. I didn't until my kids were kind of more middle school age, but the concept of a good enough parent. And once I realized, oh, am I a good enough parent to these 3 kids? Yeah, I'm good enough. Am I perfect? Absolutely not. But if you strive for something that's unachievable, you're going to drive yourself crazy. I was making myself more anxious, right? And the kids could feel the anxiety, and they literally kind of remember when I let go of that, and they're like, "Oh, Mom, you were just, you were just more calm in the house, right?" And I mistakenly, I will say, when I was a parent, I mistakenly thought when kind of the advent of social media came out, because of the way my kids are gated, it was not there when my oldest daughter was in middle school, but it was there by the time my youngest one went to middle school. And I thought, oh, social media is going to help. People are going to realize life is more messy. Unfortunately, the opposite is true. People show the perfect birthday party, the perfect event at the park, the perfect this. And so the pressure on moms and even dads is even more intense now. And it just shouldn't be. Like, life is messy. Like, there's lots of messy moments in life, right?
You know, I think in the end, the kids are valued when they see a mom who loves doing something, whatever work it is, so that they want that person they love to be happy doing something else. But, you know, somehow people didn't feel that way in the old days, so.
That's right. And so I have a daughter, son, daughter, and all three of them are working. And my oldest daughter's in residency right now, and she has 2 young girls, ages 3 and 1. And she says she's like, it is hard, but I also want to work.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
She knows she has that drive to be a doctor.
So one of the other things you touch on, I think, is something that we all are thinking about today, which is loneliness as a public health issue. I mean, when you see the statistics of the numbers of people in the country that feel lonely, one of the loveliest threads, I think, in your book is your emphasis on friendship. And you have something you call the Truth Council, that trusted group of girlfriends who've helped carry you through your triumphs and your trials. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I have 3 female friends in particular. We meet every single Monday morning. And it started when our kids were in school right after drop-off, different schools. We would meet up. We used to be a jogging group. Then we were a walking group. At the moment, I'm sporting a lovely brace, and we've all been through various things, pregnancies and injuries. So right now we're a coffee group. We will go back to walking in about 3 weeks. But they're my Truth Council. I call them that because one of them is John Nielsen, who I mentioned earlier, his wife. We show up and you say the truth about what's going on in your life. And it's that authenticity of being fully known. What are you wrestling with? What's difficult? What's gone well? Where did I mess up as a parent over the weekend? And it always kept me true to my values, because I could often think, like, on a Wednesday, I'm going to meet with my Truth Council on Monday. I better make sure I don't, mess this up in between. But more than that, it's just a genuine friendship. And we've been through births and deaths and parental deaths. And, we read about this loneliness epidemic. And it was so interesting to me when the book first came out and I was kind of on tour doing it. I went to a group of young men and women who were being taught, they were all middle schoolers, being taught an appropriate use of social media, not the use they kind of got used to during COVID. And as they were learning, they were pretty far into their kind of year-long course, and I was asking them, what have you learned? And they said, we thought friends on social media were real friends.
Wow, yeah.
And we learned that, in fact, when you get back to school after COVID and you're in the cafeteria, those aren't your real friends, And so they're learning how to make friends. Whereas to me, I guess, because I grew up in a neighborhood and you biked with whoever was around and you went and caught somebody's dog when they went out of the gate or whatever, we just sort of had natural friends. And so I always knew that wherever I went, it was important to gather a group of friends. And then I would also say, probably because of my mom, she often had groups of female friends that are lifelong friends for her, and to this day, and I still know many of them and got their Christmas cards or go see them when I'm in Dallas.
It's interesting. When I was growing up like you, I grew up on a block. My best friends, we had a driveway very narrow that separated my house from her house. Our windows were right across from each other. We could talk into the middle of the night, and we could just be let out in the day, and our moms would call us home at the end of the day. And that doesn't happen as much anymore. So you have to figure out time to spend with friends. And I'm not sure that when I had kids and I was going through work that I did it very well until actually after my husband died. I moved from my big house in Concord because it was too lonely to be there without him, into a condo in the city overlooking the park. And I was really lonely for the first time, I think, in my life. And luckily, well, not luckily, sadly, 3 of my 4 friends had lost our husbands about the same time. So that started a group every Tuesday night. Religiously, we go to this club, which was in Algonquin, an old male club, now has been turned into this hot new club. And we have dinner together, and we do anything not to miss that night. And we talk about not just our lives. There's 6 of us now, a couple of them still have husbands. And we go places together. We're now taking field trips together, to the art museum, or a couple of them I couldn't go, went to London a couple weeks ago. And it means everything, because then we talk about politics and we talk about what's going on in Washington, and we all care about that, but we start with that vulnerability. and I can be open with them. I wasn't so good at that when I was young. My friends took me aside in college, I remember one time, and said, you always listen to us about what's wrong with us, and you never tell us what you're feeling bad about. I have a hard time doing that. Maybe it was because of my mother dying young. When I went back, the day after she died, I went back to school, and I didn't want people to pity me, so I didn't want to talk about it. And that's not a good thing. You have to talk about grief when you feel it. And friends help you to do that.
And I think to have an authentic friendship, both people have to show up vulnerably, right? Doesn't mean every single time you get together that, oh my God, this happened to me. But if you can't be vulnerable with me and I can't be vulnerable with you, then that's not a really deep friendship. It's not intimate,
that's exactly
right?
So where do you meet on these Mondays?
Well, right now we're meeting in a coffee shop.
Because you're not running around.
We have a mutual place. So we live in different parts of the city, and we all meet at a coffee shop. Normally, there's an arboretum in Seattle. We normally meet there to walk. And 10 years ago, we met at a different place in another part of Seattle because our kids went to different schools, but we met up at a place that was close enough to their schools to all gather and walk. Yeah.
Wow. So now let's talk about your decision to leave the Gates Foundation and start Pivotal, which is focused on building power for women in the world. Hooray! So what led you to leave Gates Foundation and to focus on building power for women?
Well, I was lucky enough for 25 years to have traveled the globe for the foundation. I've been to over 36 countries, I think, in Africa, all over Southeast Asia, because I felt like the only way to understand the work was to really be out there with people on the ground doing the work, or I stayed in people's homes sometimes. And what I learned from that over time was the absolute importance of women being able to have their voice, being able to make decisions for themselves, and be able to have their own resources. And yet in so many places in the world, that's not true. And as I started, and so I really worked over time in the foundation. I could see that for our work to be more effective, we needed to make sure women could step into their power. Because when they could step into their power in their community or in their marriage or in parliament, things changed. And the data, as we collected more data, the data bore it out as well. But as I would turn the question back on myself, as I would be flying home, I'd be so frustrated. Why that community, I wish those women had more power. And I also learned from women in communities that if they couldn't find their own voice, that in collective, they could find voice to move things and change things. And I would turn the question back on myself, though, is like, well, how much power do we really have as women in the United States? And we have made progress. Absolutely, we have made progress. But in my mind, we haven't made enough progress. And so while I was still at the foundation in 2015, I formed an organization called Pivotal Ventures. And it really was focused on in the United States, how do we make sure that women step more fully into their power? And so as I got the work more baked in at the foundation, the gender work, there's a whole gender division there, I realized I was ready to step out and do that full time. And so where the foundation, more than 70% of its funding is international and less than 30% is US, I'm just the opposite at Pivotal. 70% is US and 30% is international. Those are the rough numbers.
Yeah, yes. We need, this country needs healing, so I think that's a wonderful thing to be able to do.
Thank you.
So do you travel around the country then now?
I do. I definitely do.
And tell us some of the things you're supporting in the foundation.
Yeah. So at Pivotal Ventures, we're all about, as I said, how do we help women step into their power? And so I think of 4 really key sectors in the United States and quite honestly around the world. Politics, because when you have women on a city council, when you have women in a parliament, when you have women in a state legislature, they make different policy. They don't make better policy, they don't make worse policy, they just make different policy. And so I want to make sure we get more women into seats of power because of the policy changes, for instance, in the United States. So that's one area, politics, I would say. Another one is financial. Finance is where we move money, how we fund things in this country. So getting more women into the top parts of the financial industry. Tech. There are far too few women in technology these days, and we're seeing we're all using it. It has vast ramifications on our lives, But again, when you have a woman with a seat at the table, again, she just has a different perspective. And then the last one I would say is media, because that's where we tell our stories, and we know storytelling just makes a huge difference in society because it helps us see who we can be.
Oh, well, there's no question. I think we were talking about that this morning, with talking about old Abraham Lincoln and being able to imagine another way of life because of having read books. You know, sometimes somebody can get dreams and hopes which they don't find in their own environment, but they get it through literature, they get it through poetry, and it's so important to give that storytelling ability.
Yeah, my dad used to say to us growing up, I read a lot growing up, and he would say, it's the places you go, the people you meet, and the stories that you read that are going to.
You were a good student always, right?
Yeah, I was that.
Me too.
A+ student, which is good. It gets you certain places, but again, it can lead to perfectionism. But
Yeah.
you talk about that with Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, if she hadn't brought the stories back to the White House of what was going on around the country, she was the eyes and ears, right?
We were just talking about that because of Franklin's polio. He was not able to travel as easily around the country when he was governor and president, but he sent her 200 days a year. She went around the country and she would look at New Deal programs and she would decide which ones were working, which were failing. You know, from bureaucracies and leadership, it doesn't often come down. And she came home and she sent him so many memos that he made her a deal. 3 memos a night, Eleanor, and I'll read them, put them in a little Eleanor basket. And he said, by God, she was right 90% of the time. And he was able to make decisions because of that. No, I think that's true.
And to have that perspective, right?
Yeah. And you need, everybody leader needs perspective of somebody who's willing to tell them the truth.
Ugh. And it's the hardest thing to get. The higher up you get in an organization, the harder it is to get.
Do you sometimes say to yourself, oh my God, I'm this leader of this big thing and I have responsibilities and it's scary?
Sometimes. I guess I felt that way more at the foundation, like when I would be going in and meeting with presidents and prime ministers. I don't choose to do that as much anymore. I certainly go to the Hill because that's where we make good policy in the United States. I just honestly, I've learned that having gratitude is one of the most important things in life, and I'm just grateful. I'm grateful I'm in a position where I can decide to spend resources on other people who are moving society forward or make decisions in that way.
So,
Thank you.
So one of the things you've said, and I think a lot of us feel that way who get older, that you're sad about the thought that your granddaughters will grow up potentially with less freedom than we've had, and that's motivated your advocacy for girls. What do you want young women to know as they step into the future, knowing where they are now, where they were before, and maybe where they hopefully have to go? We have to go forward again.
Totally. I want them to know they can be whoever they want to be in whatever situation they want to be in, right? And I think too often we have sent girls out in society and they may have been in a very supportive home environment or very supportive in sports and, you know, gone to the college they wanted to go to, got the job they wanted to go to, but then society tells them, well, you need to look a certain way, or you need to be a certain way, or you speak out too much. No, you get to be anything you want to be. And so that's a message I want to make sure all girls and women continue to know and hear.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so you've turned 60, which seems to me like you're very young at my time.
Thank you.
And you spent a lot of time thinking about the seasons of a woman's life. How do you view this next season of your life? When you think about the future of it?
It's fantastic.
Oh, what a great thing to hear.
It's so fantastic. I mean, I always thought, like, when my kids were really little, I thought, oh my God, how, you know, when they leave and they're all gone and empty nest, oh my gosh, I have this work I love, but what's it going to feel like? And as my youngest says today, she's 23 and running a business in New York, and she says, oh yeah, my mom gets in touch with me and she's in Italy, or she's funding some new thing that's really great, or she's visited a project. Like, my mom's living her best life. And I do feel that way at 60. I'm healthy, I can do whatever I want, you know.
Including helicopter skiing.
Including heli skiing, and I'll be back next season.
No, it's a wonderful thing. I mean, I feel that way at 80. There's something about looking back and feeling glad for the life I've led, but feeling excited about all the things I'm still doing. I can't stop. Somebody says, aren't you going to retire? What am I going to do if I retire? I can't possibly not imagine writing or getting involved in movies. I mean, and the older you get, the more you value, I think, what's happened to you, and you're grateful. I really do feel that sense of grateful for the life I've led up till now. I mean, there have been hard things through it, as everybody experiences, but I'm still here, and I'm still loving work, and I still feel like I could live for another 20 years.
And I think, yeah.
I know that's nuts.
Well, and don't you think it's because you're also, as you said, work, love, and play. You love what you're doing. You love writing, right? And you know it makes a difference. People read those stories and go, wow, I could be like Eleanor Roosevelt, or I could be more of a leader like a Lincoln was a leader, you know? And yeah, I think there's something beautiful about getting to these ages and being able to start to reflect a bit.
Yeah, it certainly is. It really, I mean, I think back on Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, she was such a force at her time, and she was way ahead of other women. In a certain sense, that's why she wasn't as troubling to men as Hillary Clinton was, because Hillary was coming at a time when lots of women were wanting to be like Hillary and were like them, and the men felt more challenged by it, I think, in a way. Whereas Eleanor was so far ahead of her time that people didn't have to worry that suddenly their wives were going to become Eleanor Roosevelt and be out there as she was. So, I mean, I would have loved to have met her. I mean, she's just I think, the most extraordinary woman that I've ever read about.
Yeah.
I mean, she started, we were talking about that, childcare is one of the most important things today in this world that has to happen, right? And there's no way that women can balance family and home without childcare. And somehow when it was introduced at first in World War II, there was a lot of concern that the worst mother was better than the best childcare, that it was terrible to have your kid go to childcare. It's socializing for children. If it's the right, they learn how to be with other kids. And there's such a lack of it. And that's one of the problems for so many people in today's world. Are you involved in that too?
Very much.
So tell us about that.
And again, that's what I mean about we need good policy. So there are states that are passing really good policy now for paid family medical leave. That is, that you can care for a child, both the mother and the father, after the birth of a child, because we know if the father's involved early on, he stays involved for the kid's life, which is great for the child, great for the household. So I'm involved in that. I'm also, though, involved in trying to pass better child care legislation. And you're starting to see even more cities say, look, we ought to really have not just kindergarten, but free pre-K and maybe even child care, right? We see other countries doing really well, like Norway, because of it. So, and it is funny, you and I were talking backstage, a lot of these places, like you were saying, I didn't know that, factories used to have childcare there. I know work environments that used to have childcare there, but we eventually separated these issues as a country instead of keeping them together.
Yeah, it makes so much sense when you think about a building. If the childcare is right there where the people are coming to work, then they can stop it and see the kid at every moment. I mean, that's what happened. We were talking about that during World War II. I mean, all those factories and shipyards, they had these 24-hour-day childcare. And they had the best teachers coming in. The kids are learning. They provided hot meals for the people to take home at the end of the day so they wouldn't have to cook. No wonder productivity was so high.
And yeah, and they knew that if they wanted the women to work, they had to provide childcare.
Right.
So we know that it affects a woman even more than a man, right? We expect her to do that work if no one else is going to do it, right? And so it's like, again, that's what I mean about having women in positions of power. They have a different lens on it, so they'll say, this is a policy that can work for us and work in a way to keep society healthy and kids growing up well and be productive.
You know, the funny thing was when these factory owners found productivity going way up and they hadn't thought they could bring women in, they thought they would divert attention from the men. They would never learn to operate these complicated machines. So they did a study and they figured out, wow, productivity's gone up. How has it happened? So they said it was very simple. When a woman, unlike a man, came into the factory and was asked to operate a new piece of machinery, she would ask directions, unlike the guys. I think it was more complicated than that, but obviously there was a sense of that. So just in closing, we're living in difficult and scary times. And what, if you could offer advice to people in the audience, what gives you hope about how our country is going to get through this difficult time?
I would say, we have been through difficult times before. I think many of you in here lived during the Vietnam Wars and Watergate, and Civil War was an incredibly difficult time for our country, right? We have gotten through difficult times before. This one is really difficult. But what I say to people and what I see is when I go out into communities and I see communities helping one another, see people forming things that say, this is a need in our community. Let's step up and do it. I'll give you an example. Right before Christmas, I was at something in my own backyard in Seattle called Perinatal Services of Washington State. And these women had figured out, which is absolutely true, when you look at depression for women, after a woman has a baby, usually the next time she's seen by a doctor is at that first pediatrician appointment for her child. But that's 6 weeks out. So her chance of falling into depression is very high. And talk about a time you're lonely, new baby, not sleeping.
Fearful.
Fearful, not sure who you are. And so what they figured out was this organization that came together is that they could come together and use volunteers, moms who'd been through it before. It created meaningful work for those moms who were still home with children. They got training and they could answer the phones and be counsel to these women who were going through depression. And it was a safe place for women to call in, and then they have a good way of referring them out if it's a very serious case early. But that is like one tiny example of what I have seen. There are so many things going on in communities where people are coming together. And so I always say to people, go out and see projects, see what's going on, see where the needs are, figure out what you can do. We all have things that we can do to help one another, right? I'm encouraged, even some of the things I see being created online for mental health services for kids, something called Little Otter.
Little Otter?
Little Otter, yeah. It helps parents early see issues with their kids and then connect them to resources for mental health. We're seeing a mental health crisis in our country. So I think about it in the work that I do with Pivotal Ventures, that we are creating fires. We are helping light fires all over the country of these people doing this work. We're helping fund them, help them bring in more of what they need. And it is us, it's the grassroots that changes a country. I've seen it over and over again around the world.
Absolutely
and so there's just a lot of need.
No, in fact, Abraham Lincoln, when he was called a liberator, he said, don't call me that. It was the anti-slavery movement and the Union soldiers that did it all. It was the progressive movement that was in the cities. Jane Addams, we were talking about her backstage before Teddy Roosevelt was able to do what he did. It was the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement. It's always from the ground up. If I had one thing I could do now, I would love to see an internal national service program in this country. I mean, if we could get kids, you can think about that. If we could get kids from high school to go to a different part of the country, we have right now people in different classes feeling the other people are different. Teddy Roosevelt warned that if democracy would be in peril, if people in different classes and sections and regions began to view each other as the other rather than as common American citizens. We know what the military does when it has a common mission and people from different classes work together. If we could we know the Peace Corps worked abroad, but we need it at home right now. And if they went after high school and were in another part of America, they were doing something that would make things good in the community. There's so much need for things. There's disaster relief, there's education. Then maybe they'll see other people as common American citizens, and we need to engender that feeling again.
Yeah, we're more alike than we are different.
I really believe that. I really believe that.
It's true. I've seen it all over the world. And yet, if we don't get out of our community to see what's going on, you can't find those commonalities, right? It's too easy to be online and, yelling at the other person over, social media or whatever you're doing. It's when you get out there and you see, oh, okay, here's where change happens.
I am so glad that we've been able to talk. I mean, and I'd just like to think about your father and mother and how lucky they are and how lucky you are that they've seen that this little girl who worked really hard and was trying to be a perfectionist has grown into this woman who's doing extraordinary things for our country. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
What fun.